Chapter 17 of Under the Andes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Under the Andes by Rex Stout. Chapter 17. The Eyes in the Dark. The thing was at a considerable distance. We could barely see that it was there, and that it was moving. It was of an immense size, so large that it appeared as though the very side of the cavern itself had moved noiselessly from its bed in the mountain. At the same moment I became aware of a penetrating, disagreeable odor, nauseating and horrible. I had risen to my knees and remained so, while Harry and Desiree stood on either side of me. The thing continued to move toward us, very slowly. There was not a sound. The strength of the odor increased until it was almost suffocating. Still we did not move. I could not, and Harry and Desiree seemed rooted to the spot with wonder. The thing came closer, and we could see the outlines of its huge form looming up indistinctly against the black background of the cavern. I saw, or thought I saw, a grotesque and monstrous slimy head stretched toward us from about the middle of its bulk. That doubt became a certainty when suddenly, as though they had been lit by a fire from within, two luminous, glowing spots appeared about 3 feet apart. The creature's eyes, if eyes they were turned full on us, growing more brilliant as the thing came closer. It was now less than 50 feet away. The massive form blocked our view of the entire cavern. I pinched my nostrils to exclude the horrible odor which, like the fumes of some deadly poison, choked and smothered me. It came now in puffs, like a draught of a fetid wind, and I realized that it was the creature's breath. I could feel it against my body, my neck and face, and I knew that if I breathed it full into my lungs I should be overcome. But still more terrifying were the eyes. There was something compelling, supernaturally compelling, about their steadfast and brilliant gaze. A mysterious power seemed to emanate from them, a power that hypnotized the mind and deadened the senses. I closed my eyes to avoid it, but was unable to keep them closed. They opened despite my extreme effort, and again I met that gaze of fire. There was a movement at my side. I turned and saw that it came from Desiree. Her hands were raised to her face. She was holding them before her as though in a futile attempt to cover her eyes. The thing came closer and closer. It was but a few feet away, and still we did not move, as though rooted to the spot by some power beyond our control. Suddenly there came a cry from Desiree's lips, a scream of terror and wild fear. Her entire form trembled violently. She extended her arms toward the thing, now almost upon us, and took a step forward. Her feet dragged unwilling along the ground, as though she were being drawn forward by some irresistible force. I tried to put out my hand to pull her back, but was absolutely unable to move. Harry stood like a man of rock, immovable. She took another step forward, with arms outstretched in front of her. A low moan of terror and piteous appeal came from between her slightly parted lips. Suddenly the eyes disappeared. The huge form ceased to advance, and stood perfectly still. Then it began to recede, so slowly that I was barely conscious of the movement. I was gasping and choking for air. My chest seemed swelling with the poisonous breath. Still slowly the thing receded into the dimness of the cavern. The eyes were no longer to be seen, merely the huge, formless bulk. Desiree had stopped short with one foot advanced, as though hesitating and struggling with the desire to go forward. The thing now could barely be seen at a distance. It would have been impossible if we had not known it was there. Finally it disappeared, melting away into the semi-darkness, No slightest movement was discernible. I breathed more freely and stepped forward. As I did so, Desiree threw her hands gropingly above her head and fell fainting to the ground. Harry sprang forward in time to keep her head from striking on the rock, and knelt with his arms round her shoulders. We had nothing, not even water, with which to revive her. He called her name aloud, appealingly. Soon her eyes opened. She raised her hand and passed it across her brow wonderingly. "God help me!" she murmured in a low voice, eloquent of distress and pain. Then she pushed Harry aside and rose slowly to her feet, refusing his assistance. "In the name of heaven, what is it?" Harry demanded, turning to me. "We have found the devil at last," I answered, with an attempt to laugh, which sounded hollow in my own ears. Desiree could tell us nothing, except that she had felt herself drawn forward by some strange power that had seemed to come from the baneful, glittering eyes. She was bewildered and stunned, and unable to talk coherently. We assisted her to the wall, and she sat there with her back propped against it, breathing heavily from the exhaustion of terror. "We must find water," I said. And Harry nodded, hesitating. I understood him. Danger could not have stayed him, nor fear, but the horror of the thing which roamed about the cavern, dark as darkness itself, and possessed of some strange power that could not be withstood, was enough to make him pause. For myself, it was impossible. I was barely able to stand. So Harry went off alone in search of water, and I stayed with Desiree. It was perhaps half an hour before he returned, and we were shaken with fear for him long before he appeared. When he did so, it was with a white face and trembling limbs, in spite of his evident effort at steadiness. "There is water over there," said he, pointing across the cavern. "A stream runs across the corner and disappears beneath the wall. There is nothing to carry it in. You must come with me." "What has happened?" I asked, for even his voice was unsteady. "I saw it," he replied simply, but expressing enough in those 3 words to cause a shudder to run through me. Then, speaking in a low tone that Desiree might not hear, he told me that the thing had confronted him suddenly as he was following the opposite wall, and that he, too, had been drawn forward, as it were, by a spell impossible to shake off. He had tried to cry aloud, but had been unable to utter a sound. And suddenly, as before, the eyes had disappeared, leaving him barely able to stand. "No wonder the Incas wouldn't follow us in here," he finished. "We must get out of this. I'm not a coward, but I wouldn't go through that again for my life." "You take Desiree," said I. "I want that water." He led us around the wall several hundred feet. The ground was level and clear of obstruction, but we went slowly, for I could scarcely move. Harry kept his eyes strained intently on all sides. His experience had left him more profoundly impressed even than he had been willing to admit to me. Soon we heard the low music of running water, and a minute later we reached the stream Harry had found. The fact that there was something to be done seemed to infuse a new spirit into Desiree, and soon her deft fingers were bathing my wounds and bandaging them as well as her poor material would allow. The cold water took the heat from my pumping veins and left me almost comfortable. Harry had come off much easier than I, since I had so often sent him ahead with Desiree, and myself brought up the rear and withstood the brunt of the attack. As Harry had said, the stream cut across a corner of the cavern, disappearing beneath the opposite wall, forming a triangle bound by 2 sides of the cavern and the stream itself. I saw plainly that it would be impossible for me to move any distance for at least a few days, and that triangle appeared to offer the safest and most comfortable retreat. I spoke to Harry, and he waded across the stream to try its depth. From the other side he called that the water was at no point more than waist high, and Desiree and I started to cross, but, about the middle, I felt the current about to sweep me off my feet. Harry waded in and helped me ashore. On that hard rock we lay for many weary hours. We had no food. But for that I would soon have been myself again, for, though my wounds were numerous, they were little more than scratches, with the exception of the gash on my shoulder. Weakened as I was by loss of blood, and lacking nourishment, I improved but slowly, and only the cold water kept the fever from me. Twice Harry went out in search of food and of an exit from the cavern. The first time he was away for several hours, and returned exhausted and empty-handed, and without having found any exit other than the one by which we had entered. He had ventured through that far enough to see a group of Incas on watch at the other end. They had seen him and sprung after him, but he had returned without injury, and at the entrance into the cavern where we lay they had halted abruptly. The second time he was gone out more than half an hour, and the instant I saw his face when he returned, I knew what had happened. But I was not in the best of humor. His terror appeared to me to be ridiculously childish, and I said so in no uncertain terms. But he was too profoundly agitated to show any anger. "You don't know, was all he said in answer to me. Then he added, "I can't stand this any longer. I tell you, we've got to get out of here. You don't know how awful—" "Yes," said Desiree, looking at me. "But I can scarcely walk," I objected. "True," said Harry, "I know, but we can help you. There must be another exit, and we'll start now." "Very well," I said quite calmly, and I picked up one of the spears which we had carried with us, and, rising to my knees, placed the butt of the shaft against the wall near which I lay. But Harry saw my purpose and was too quick for me. He sprang across and snatched the spear from my hand and threw it on the ground a dozen feet away. "Are you crazy?" he shouted angrily. "No," I answered. "But I am little better, and I doubt if I shall be. Come, why not? I hinder you and become bored with myself." "You blame me," he said bitterly, "but I tell you, you don't know." "Very well, we stay. You must give me your promise not to act the fool." "In any event, you must go soon," I answered, "or starve to death. Perhaps in another 24 hours I shall be stronger. Come, Desiree, will that satisfy you?" She did not answer. Her back was turned to us as she stood gazing across the stream into the depths of the cavern. There was a curious tenseness in her attitude that made me follow her gaze, and what I saw left me with no wonder at it: a huge, black, indistinct form that moved slowly toward us through the darkness. Harry caught sight of it at the same moment as myself, and on the instant he turned about, covering his face with his hands, and called to Desiree and me to do likewise. Desiree obeyed. I had risen to my knees and remained so, gazing straight ahead, ready for a combat if it were not a physical one. I will not say that a certain feeling of dread did not rise in my heart, but I intended to show Desiree and Harry the childishness of their terror. Nothing could be seen but the uncertain outline of the immense bulk, but the same penetrating, sickening odor that had before all but suffocated me came faintly across the surface of the stream, growing stronger with each second that passed. Suddenly the eyes appeared, two glowing orbs of fire that caught my gaze and held it as with a chain. I did not attempt to avoid it, but returned the gaze with another as steadfast. I was telling myself, Let us see this trick and play one stronger." My nerves centered throbbingly back of my eyes, and I gave them the whole force of my will. The thing came closer, and the eyes seemed to burn into my very brain. With a great effort I brought myself back to control, dropping to my hands and knees and gripping the ground for strength. "This is nothing. This is nothing," I kept saying to myself aloud, until I realized suddenly that my voice had risen almost to a scream, and I locked my teeth tight on my lip. I no longer returned the gaze from my own power. It held me of itself. I felt my brain grow curiously numb, and every muscle in my body contracted with a pain almost unbearable. Still the thing came closer and closer, and it seemed to me, half dazed as I was, that it advanced much faster than before. Then suddenly I felt a sensation of cold and moisture on my arms and legs, and a pressure against my body, and I realized, as in a dream, that I had entered the stream of water. I was crawling toward the thing on my hands and knees, without having even been conscious that I had moved. That brought despair and a last supreme struggle to resist whatever mysterious power it was that dragged me forward. Cold beads of sweat rolled from my forehead. Beneath the surface of the water my hands gripped the rocks as in a vise. My teeth had sunk deep into my lower lip and covered my chin with blood, though I did not know that till afterward. But I was pulled loose from my hold and forward. I bent the whole force of my will to the effort not to move, but my hand left the rock and crept forward. I was fully conscious of what I was doing. I knew that if I could once draw my eyes away from that compelling gaze, the spell would be broken, but the power to do so was not in me. The thing had halted on the farther bank of the stream. Still I moved forward. The water now lapped against my chest. Soon it was about my shoulders. I was fully conscious of the fact that in another 10 feet the surface would close over my head, and that I had not the strength to swim or fight the current. But still I went forward. I tried to cry out, but could force no sound through my lips. Then suddenly the eyes began to disappear. But that at least was comprehensible, for I could distinctly see the black and heavy lids closing over them, like the curtain on a stage. They fell slowly. The eyes became half moons, then narrowed to a thin slit. I rose, panting like a man exhausted with extreme and prolonged physical exertion. The eyes were gone. A mad impulse rushed into my brain to dash forward and touch the monster, to see if that dim, black form were really a thing of flesh and blood or some contrivance of the devil. I smile at that phrase as I write it now in my study, but I did not smile then. I was standing above my knees in the water, trembling from head to foot, divided between the impulse to go forward and the inclination to flee in terror. I did neither. I stood still. I could see the thing with a fair amount of distinctness, and forced my brain to take the record of my eyes. But I could make nothing of it. I guessed at rather than saw a hideous head rolling from side to side at the end of a long and sinuous neck, and writhing reptilian coils lashing the rock at the edge of the water like the tentacles of an octopus, only many times larger. The body itself was larger than that of any animal I had ever seen, and blacker even than the darkness. Suddenly the huge mass began to move slowly backward. The sharpness of the odor had ceased with the opening of the eyes, which did not reappear. I could dimly see its huge legs slowly rise and recede and again meet the ground. Soon the thing was barely discernible. I took a step forward as though to follow, but the strength of the current warned me of the danger of proceeding farther, and, besides, I feared every moment to see the lids again raised from the terrible eyes. The thought attacked my brain with horror, and I turned and fled in a sudden panic to the rear, calling to Harry and Desiree. They met me at the edge of the stream, and their eyes told me that they read in my face what had happened, though they had seen nothing. You saw it," Harry stammered. I nodded, scarcely able to speak. "Then perhaps now—" "Yes," I interposed. "Let's get out of here. It's horrible. And yet how can we go? I can hardly stand." But Harry was now the one who argued for delay, saying that our retreat was the safest place we could find, and that we should wait at least until I had had time to recover from the strain of the last half hour. Realizing that in my weakened condition I would be a hindrance to them rather than a help, I consented. Besides, if the thing reappeared, I could avoid it, as Harry and Desiree had done. "What is it?" Harry asked presently. We were sitting side by side, well up against the wall. It was an abrupt question, with no apparent pertinence, but I understood. "Heaven knows," I answered shortly. I was none too pleased with myself. "But it must be something. Is it an animal?" "Do you remember," I asked by way of answer, "a treatise of Aristotle concerning which we had a discussion one day? Its subject was the hypnotic power possessed by the eyes of certain reptiles. I laughed the idea to scorn. You maintained that it was possible. Well, I agree with you, and I'd like to have about a dozen of our modern skeptical scientists in this cave with me for about 5 minutes." "But what is it? A reptile?" Harry exclaimed. "The thing is as big as a house." "Well, and why not? I should guess that it is about 30 feet in height and 40 or 50 in length. There have been species, now extinct, several times as large." "Then you think it is just an animal?" put in Desiree. "What did you think it was?" I nearly smiled. "An infernal machine?" "I don't know. Only I have never before known what it was to fear." A discussion which led us nowhere, but at least gave us the sound of one another's voices. We passed many hours in that manner, utterly blank and wearisome, and all but hopeless. I have often wondered at the strange tenacity with which we clung to life in conditions that made of it a burden almost insupportable, and with what chance of relief? The instinct of self-preservation it is called by the learned, but it needs a stronger name. It is more than an instinct. It is the very essence of life itself. But soon we were impelled to action by something besides the desire to escape from the cavern, the pangs of hunger. It had been many hours since we had eaten. I think we had fasted not less than 3 or 4 days. Desiree began to complain of a dizziness in her temples, and to weaken with every hour that passed. My own strength did not increase, and I saw that it would not unless I could obtain nourishment. Harry did not complain, but only because he would not. "It is useless to wait longer," I declared finally. "I grow weaker instead of stronger." We had little enough with which to burden ourselves. There were 3 spears, 2 of which Harry had brought, and myself the other. Harry and I wore only our woolen undergarments, so ragged and torn that they were but sorry covering. Desiree's single garment, made from some soft hide, was held about her waist by a girdle of the same material. The upper half of her body was bare. Her hair hung in a tangled mass over her shoulders and down her back. None of us had any covering for our feet. We crossed the stream, using the spears as staffs, but instead of advancing across the middle of the cavern, we turned to the left, hugging the wall. Harry urged us on, saying that he had already searched carefully for an exit on that side, but we went slowly, feeling for a break in the wall. It was absolutely smooth, which led me to believe that the cavern had at one time been filled with water. We reached the farther wall, and turning to the right, were about to follow it. "This is senseless," said Harry impatiently. "I tell you I have examined this side too, every inch of it." "And the one ahead of us, at right angles to this?" I asked. "That too," he answered. "And the other, the one to the right of the stream?" "No, I didn't go there." "Why didn't you say so?" I demanded. "Because I didn't want to," he returned sullenly. "You can go there if you care to. I don't. It was from there that it came." I did not answer, but pushed forward, not, however, leaving the wall. Perhaps it was cowardly. You are welcome to the word if you care to use it. Myself, I know. Another half hour and we reached the end of the lane by which we had first entered the cavern. We stood gazing at it with eyes of desire, but we knew how little chance there was of the thing being unguarded at the farther end. We knew then, of course, and only too well, why the Incas had not followed us into the cavern. "Perhaps they are gone," said Harry. "They can't stay there forever. I'm going to find out." He sprang to the edge of a boulder at the mouth of the passage and disappeared on the other side. In 15 minutes he returned, and I saw by the expression on his face that there was no chance of escape in that direction. "They're at the other end," he said gloomily. "A dozen of 'em. I looked from behind a rock. They didn't see me. But we could never get through." We turned then and proceeded to the third wall and followed it. But we really had no hope of finding an exit, since Harry had said that he had previously explored it. We were possessed, I know, by the same thought. Should we venture to follow the fourth wall? Alone, none of us would have dared, but the presence of the others lessened the fear of each. Finally we reached it. The corner was a sharp right angle, and there were rifts and crevices in the rock. "This is limestone," I said, "and if we find an exit anywhere, it'll be here." I turned to the right and proceeded slowly along the wall, feeling its surface with my hand. We had advanced in this manner several hundred yards when Desiree suddenly sprang forward to my side. "See!" she cried, pointing ahead with her spear. I followed the direction with my eye, and saw what appeared to be a sharp break in the wall. It was some 50 feet away. We reached it in another moment, and I think none of us would have been able to express the immeasurable relief we felt when we saw before us a broad and clear passage leading directly away from the cavern. It was very dark, but we entered it almost at a run. I think we had not known the extent of our fear of that thing in the cavern until we found the means of escape from it. We had gone about 100 feet when we came to a turn to the left. Harry stumbled against the corner, and we halted for an instant to wait for him. Then we made the turn, side by side, and then we came to a sudden and abrupt stop, and a simultaneous gasp of terror burst from our lips. Not 3 feet in front of us, blocking the passage completely, stood the thing we thought we had escaped. The terrible fiery eyes rolled from side to side as they stared straight into our own. End of chapter 17. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 18 of Under the Andes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Under the Andes by Rex Stout. Chapter 18. A Victory and a Conversation. We stood for a long moment rooted to the spot, unable to move. Then, calling to Harry and grasping Desiree by the arm, I started to turn. But too late. For Desiree, inspired by a boundless terror, suddenly raised her spear high above her head and hurled it straight at the glowing, flashing eyes. The point struck squarely between them and with such force that it must have sunk clear to the shaft. The head of the monster rolled for an instant from side to side, and then, before I was aware of what had happened, so rapid was the movement, a long snake-like coil had reached out through the air and twisted itself about Desiree's body. As she felt the thing tighten about her waist and legs, she gave a scream of terror and twisted her face round toward me. The next instant the snaky tentacle had dragged her along the ground and lifted her to the head of the monster, where her white body could be seen in sharp outline, sprawling over its black form, between the terrible eyes. Harry and I sprang forward. As we did so, the eyes closed, and the reptile began to move backward with incredible swiftness, lashing about on the ground before us with other tentacles similar to the one that had captured Desiree. I cried out to Harry to avoid them. He did not answer, but rushed blindly forward. Desiree's agonized shrieks rose to the pitch of madness. The eyes were closed, leaving but a vague mark for our spears, and besides, there was the danger of striking Desiree. We were barely able to keep pace with the thing as it receded swiftly down the broad passage. Desiree had twisted her body half round, and her face was turned toward us, shadowy as a ghost. Then her head fell forward and hung loosely, and her lips were silent. She had fainted. The thing moved swifter than ever. We were barely able to keep up with it. Harry made a desperate leap forward. I cried out a warning, but one of the writhing tentacles swept against him and knocked him to the ground. He was up again on the instant and came rushing up from behind. Suddenly the passage broadened until the walls were no longer visible. We had entered another cavern. I heard the sound of running water somewhere ahead of us. The pace of the reptile had not slackened for an instant. Harry had again caught up with us, and as he ran at my side I saw him raise his spear aloft, but I caught his arm and held it. "Desiree!" I panted. Her body covered the only part of the thing that presented a fair mark. Harry swore, but his arm fell. "To the side," he gasped. "We can't get at it here." I saw his meaning and followed at his heels as he swerved suddenly to the right and sprang forward in an attempt to get past the reptile's head. But in our eagerness we forgot caution and went too close. I felt one of the snaky tentacles wrap itself round my legs and body and raised my voice in a warning to Harry, but too late. He, too, was ensnared, and a moment later we had both been lifted bodily from the ground and swung through the air to the side of Desiree. She was still unconscious. I writhed and twisted desperately, but that muscular coil held me firmly as a band of steel, tight against the huge and hideous head. Harry was on the other side of Desiree, not 3 feet from me. I could see his muscles strain and pull in his violent efforts to tear himself free. I had given it up. But suddenly, quite near my shoulder, I saw the lid suddenly begin to raise itself from one of the terrible eyes. I was almost on top of the thing and a little above it. I turned my head aside and called to Harry. "The eye!" I gasped. "To your right! The spear! Are your arms free?" Then, as I saw he understood, I turned a quarter of the way around, as far as I could get, and raised my spear to the full extent of my arm, and brought it down with every ounce of my strength into the very center of the glowing eye beneath me. At the same moment I saw Harry's arm descend and the flash of his spear. The point of my own had sunk until the copper head was completely buried. I grasped the shaft and pulled and twisted it about until it finally was jerked forth. From the opening it had made there issued a black stream. Suddenly the body of the reptile quivered convulsively. The head rolled from side to side. There was a quick tightening of the tentacle round my body until my bones felt as though they were being crushed into shapelessness. And as suddenly it loosened. Other tentacles lashed and beat on the ground furiously. The reptile's swift backward movement halted jerkily. I made a desperate effort to tear myself free. The tentacle quivered and throbbed violently, and suddenly flew apart like a released spring, and I fell to the ground. In an instant Harry was at my side, and we both leaped forward with our spears, slashing at the tentacle which still held Desiree in its grasp. Others writhed on the ground about our feet, but feebly. There came a sudden cry from Harry, and his spear clattered on the ground as he opened his arms to receive Desiree's unconscious body, which came tumbling down with the severed coil still wrapped about it. But there was life in the reptile's immense body. It staggered and swayed from side to side in drunken agony. Its monstrous head rolled about, sweeping the air in a prodigious circle. The poison of its breath came to us in great puffs. There was something supremely horrible about the thing in its very helplessness, and I was shuddering violently as I stooped to help Harry lift Desiree from the ground and carry her away. We did not go far, for we were barely able to carry her. We laid her on the hard rock with her head in Harry's lap. Her body was limp as a rag. For many minutes we worked over her, rubbing her temples and wrists, and pressing the nerve centers at the back of the neck, but without effect. "She is dead," said Harry with a curious calm. I shook my head. "She has a pulse, see? But we must find that water. I think she isn't injured. It is her weakened condition from the lack of food that keeps her so. Wait for me." I started out across the cavern in the direction from which the sound of the water appeared to come, bearing off to the right from the huge, quivering form of the monster, whose gigantic body rose and fell on the ground with a force that seemed to shake the very walls of the cavern. I found the stream with little difficulty, not far away, and returned to Harry. Together we carried Desiree to its edge. The blood was stubborn, and for a long time refused to move, but the cold water at length revived her. Her eyes slowly opened, and she raised her hand to her head with a faltering gesture. But she was extremely weak, and we saw that the end was near unless nourishment could be found for her. I stayed by her side, with my arms round her shoulders, and Harry set out with one of the spears. He bore off to the left, toward the spot where the body of the immense reptile lay. I was too far away to see it in the darkness. "It isn't possible that the thing is fit to eat," I had objected, and he had answered me with a look which I understood, and was silenced. Soon a sound as of a scuffle on the rocks came through the darkness from the direction he had taken. I called out to ask if he needed me, but there was no answer. 10 minutes longer I waited, while the sound continued unabated. Once I heard the clatter of his spear on the rock. I was just rising to my feet to run to the scene, when suddenly he appeared in the semi-darkness. He was coming slowly, and was dragging along the ground what appeared to be the form of some animal. Another minute, and he stood at my side as I sat holding Desiree. "A peccary!" I cried, bending over the body of the 4-footed creature that lay at his feet. "How the deuce did it ever get down here?" "Peccary, my aunt," observed Harry, bending down to look at Desiree. "Do peccaries live in the water? Do they have snouts like catfish? This animal is my own invention. There's about 10 million more of 'em over there making a gorgeous banquet off our late lamented friend. And now let's see." He knelt down by the still warm body, and with the point of his spear ripped it open from neck to rump. Desiree stirred about in my arms. "Gad, that smells good!" cried Harry. I shuddered. He dragged the thing a few feet away, and I heard him slashing away at it with his spear. A minute later he came running over to us with his hands full of something. That was not exactly a pretty meal. How Desiree, in her frightfully weakened condition, ever managed to get the stuff down and keep it there is beyond me. But she did, and I was not behind her. And after all, it was fresh. Harry said it was sweet. Well, perhaps it was. We bathed Desiree's hands and face and gave her water to drink, and soon after she passed into a seemingly healthy sleep. There was about 10 pounds of meat left. Harry washed it in the stream and stowed it away on a rock beneath the surface of the water. Then he announced his intention of going back for more. "I'm going with you," I declared. "Here, help me fix Desiree." "Hardly," said Harry. "Didn't I say there are millions of those things over there? Anyway, there are hundreds. If they should happen to scatter in this direction and find her, she wouldn't stand a chance. You take the other spear and stay here." So I sat still, with Desiree's body in my arms, and waited for him. My sensations were not unpleasant. I could actually feel the blood quicken in my veins. Civilization places the temple of life in the soul or the heart, as she speaks through the mouth of the preacher or the poet, but let civilization go for 4 or 5 days without anything to eat and see what happens. The organ is vulgar, but its voice is loud. I need not name it. In 5 minutes Harry returned, dragging 2 more of the creatures at his heels. In half an hour there were a dozen of them lying in a heap at the edge of the water. "That's all," he announced, panting heavily from his exertions. "The rest have taken to the woods, which I imagine is quite a journey from here. You ought to see our friend, the one who couldn't make his eyes behave. They've eaten him full of holes. He's the most awful mess. Sickening beast. He didn't have a bone in him, all crumpled up like an accordion. Utterly spineless. And who, in the name of goodness, do you think is going to eat all that?" I demanded, pointing to the heap of bodies. Harry grinned. "I don't know. I was so excited at the very idea of a square meal that I didn't know when to stop. I'd give 5 fingers for a fire and some salt. Just a nickel's worth of salt. Now you lie down and sleep while I cut these things up, and then I'll take a turn at it myself." He brought me one of the hides for a pillow, and I lay back as gently as possible that I might not awaken Desiree. Her head and shoulders rested against my body as she lay peacefully sleeping. I was awakened by Harry's hand tugging at my arm. Rising on my elbows, I demanded to know how long I had slept. 6 or 7 hours, said Harry. "I waited as long as I could. Keep a lookout." Desiree stirred uneasily, but seemed to be still asleep. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. The heap of bodies had disappeared. No wonder Harry was tired. I reproached myself for having slept so long. Harry had arranged himself a bed that was really comfortable with the skins of his kill. "This is great stuff," I heard him murmur wearily. Then all was still. I sat motionless, stiff and numb, but afraid to move for fear of disturbing Desiree. Presently she stirred again, and bending over her I saw her eyes slowly open. they met my own with a curious, steadfast gaze. She was still half asleep. "Is that you, Paul?" she murmured. "Yes." "I am glad. I seem to feel what is it?" "I don't know, Desiree. What do you mean?" "Nothing, nothing. Oh, it feels so good, good to have you hold me like this." "Yes?" I smiled. "But yes. Where is Harry?" "Asleep. Are you hungry?" "Yes. No. Not now. I don't know why. I want to talk. What has happened?" I told her of everything that had occurred since she had swooned. She shuddered as memory returned, but forgot herself in my attempt at a humorous description of Harry's valor as a hunter of food. "You don't need to turn up your nose," I retorted to her expressive grimace. "You ate some of the stuff yourself." There was a silence. Then suddenly Desiree's voice came. "Paul." She hesitated and stopped. "Yes?" "What do you think of me?" "Do you want a lengthy review?" I smiled. What a woman she was! Under those circumstances, and amid those surroundings, she was still Desiree Le Mire. "Don't laugh at me," she said. "I want to know. I have never spoken of what I did that time in the cavern. You know what I mean. I am sorry now. I suppose you despise me." "But you did nothing," I objected. "And you wouldn't. You were merely amusing yourself." She turned on me quickly, with a flash of her old fire. "Don't play with me!" she burst out. "My friend, you have never yet given me a serious word." "Nor anyone else," I answered. "My dear Desiree, do you not know that I am incapable of seriousness? Nothing in the world is worth it." "At least you need not pretend," she retorted. "I meant once for you to die. You know it. And since you pretend not to understand me, I ask you, these are strange words from my lips, will you forgive me?" "There is nothing to forgive." "My friend, you are becoming dull. An evasive answer should always be a witty one. Must I ask you again?" "That depends," I answered, hardly knowing what to say. "On—" "On whether or not you were serious, once upon a time, when you made shall we call it a confession? If you were, I offended you in my own conceit. But let us be frank. I thought you were acting, and I played my role. I do not yet believe that you were. I am not conceited enough to think it possible." "I do not say—" Desiree began, then she stopped and added hastily, "But that is past. I shall not tell you that again. Perhaps I forgot myself. Perhaps it was a pretty play. You have not answered me." I looked at her. Strange and terrible as her experiences and sufferings had been, she had lost little of her beauty. Her face was rendered only the more delicate by its pallor. Her white and perfect body, only half seen in the half darkness, conveyed a sense of the purest beauty, with no hint of immodesty. But I was moved not by what I saw, but by what I knew. I had admired her always as Le Mire, but her bravery, her hardihood, her sympathy for others under circumstances when any other woman would have been thinking only of herself, had these awakened in my breast a feeling stronger than admiration? I did not know. But my voice trembled a little as I said: "I need not answer you, Desiree. I repeat that there is nothing to forgive. You sought revenge, then sacrificed it. But still revenge is yours." She looked at me for a moment in silence, then said slowly, "I do not understand you." For reply, I took her hand in my own from where it lay idly on my knee, and, carrying it to my lips, pressed a long kiss on the top of each of the slender white fingers. Then I held the hand tight between both of mine, as I asked simply, looking into her eyes, "Do you understand me now?" Another silence. "My revenge," she breathed. I nodded, and again pressed her hand to my lips. "Yes, Desiree. We are not children. I think we know what we mean. But you have not told me. Did you mean what you said that day on the mountain?" "Ah, I thought that was a play," she murmured. "Tell me, did you mean it?" "I never confess the same sin twice, my friend." "Desiree, did you mean it?" Then suddenly, with the rapidity of lightning, her manner changed. She bent toward me with parted lips and looked straight into my eyes. There was passion in the gaze, but when she spoke her voice was quite even, and so low I scarcely heard. "Paul," she said, "I shall not again say I love you. Such words should not be wasted. Not now, perhaps, but that is because we are where we are. And if we should return? You have said that nothing is worth a serious word to you, and you are right. You are too cynical. Things are bitter in your mouth, and doubly so when they leave it. Just now you are amusing yourself by pretending to care for me. Perhaps you do not know it, but you are. Search your heart, my friend, and tell me, do you want my love?" Well, there was no need to search my heart. She had laid it open. I hated myself then, and I turned away, unable to meet her eyes, as I said, "Bon Dieu!" she cried. "That is an ugly speech, monsieur." And she laughed aloud. "But we must not awaken Harry," she continued with sudden softness. "What a boy he is, and what a man! Ah, he knows what it is to love." That topic suited me little better, but I followed her. We talked of Harry, Le Mire with an amount of enthusiasm that surprised me. Suddenly she stopped abruptly and announced that she was hungry. I found Harry's pantry after a few minutes' search and took some of its contents to Desiree. Then I returned to the edge of the water and ate my portion alone. That meal was one scarcely calculated for the pleasures of companionship or conviviality. It was several hours after that before Harry awoke, the greater part of which Desiree and I were silent. I would have given something to have known her thoughts. My own were not very pleasant. It is always a disagreeable thing to discover that some one else knows you better than you know yourself. And Desiree had cut deep. At the time I thought her unjust. Time alone could have told which of us was right. If she were here with me now. But she is not. Finally Harry awoke. He was delighted to find Desiree awake and comparatively well, and demonstrated the fact with a degree of effusion that prompted me to leave them alone together. But I did not go far. 100 paces made me sit down to rest before returning, so weak was I from wounds and fasting. Harry's spirits were high, for no apparent reason other than that we were still alive, for that was the best that could be said for us. So I told him. He retorted with a hearty clap on the back that sent me sprawling to the ground. "What the deuce!" he exclaimed, stooping to help me up. "And you as weak as that? Gad, I'm sorry." "That is the second fall he has had," said Desiree with a meaning smile. Indeed, she was having her revenge. But my strength was not long in returning. Over a long stretch our diet would hardly have been conducive to health, but it was exactly what I needed to put blood and strength in me. And Harry and Desiree, too, for that matter. Again I had to withstand Harry's eager demands for action. He began within 2 hours to insist on exploring the cave, and would hardly take a refusal. "I won't stir a foot until I am able to knock you down," I declared finally and flatly. "Never again will I attempt to perform the feats of a Hercules when I am fit only for an invalid's chair." And he was forced to wait. As I say, however, my strength was not long in returning, and when it started it came with a rush. My wounds were healing perfectly, only one remained open. Harry, with his usual phenomenal luck, had got nothing but the merest scratches. Desiree improved very slowly. The strain of those 4 days in the cavern had been severe, and her nerves required more pleasant surroundings than a dark and damp cavern, and more agreeable diet than raw meat, to adjust themselves. Thus it was that when Harry and I found ourselves ready to start out to explore the cavern and, if possible, find an exit on the opposite side from the one where we had entered, we left Desiree behind, seated on a pile of skins, with a spear on the ground at her side. "We'll be back in an hour," said Harry, stooping to kiss her. And the phrase, which might have come from the lips of a worthy Harlem husband leaving for a little sojourn with friends on the corner, brought a smile to my face. We went first toward the spot where lay the remains of "our friend with the eyes," as Harry called him, and we were guided straight by our noses, for the odor of the thing was beginning to be, to use another phrase of Harry's, most awful vile. There was little to see except a massive pile of crumpled hide and sinking flesh. As we approached, several hundred of the animals with which Harry had filled our larder scampered away toward the water. "They're not fighters," I observed, turning to watch them disappear in the darkness. "No," Harry agreed. "See here," he added suddenly, holding up a piece of the hide of the reptile. "This stuff is an inch thick and tough as rats. It ought to be good for something." But by that time I was pinching my nostrils with my fingers, and I pulled him away. Several hundred yards farther on we came to the wall of the cavern. We followed it, turning to the right, but though it was uneven and marked by projecting boulders and deep crevices, we found no exit. We had gone at least half a mile, I think, when we came to the end. There it turned in a wide circle to the right, and we took the new direction, which was toward the spot where we had left Desiree, only considerably to the left. Another 5 minutes found us at the edge of the stream, which at that point was much swifter than it was farther up. We waded in, and discovered that the cause was its extreme narrowness. "But where does the thing go to?" asked Harry, taking the words from my mouth. We soon found out. Proceeding along the bank to the left, within 50 feet we came to the wall. There the stream entered and disappeared. But unlike the others we had seen, above this there was a wide and high arch, which made it appear as though the stream were passing under a massive bridge. The current was swift but not turbulent, and there was something about the surface of that stream flowing straight through the mountain ahead of us. Harry and I glanced at each other quickly, moved by the same thought. There was an electric thrill in that glance. But we did not speak, then. For suddenly, startlingly, a voice sounded throughout the cavern, Desiree's voice, raised in a shrill cry of terror. It was repeated twice before our startled senses found themselves. Then we turned with one impulse and raced into the darkness toward her. End of chapter 18. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 19 of Under the Andes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Under the Andes by Rex Stout. Chapter 19. Afloat. As we ran swiftly, following the edge of the stream, the cries continued, filling the cavern with racing echoes. They could not quicken our step. We were already straining every muscle as we bounded over the rock. Luckily, the way was clear, for in the darkness we could see but a few feet ahead. Desiree's voice was sufficient guide for us. Finally, we reached her. I don't know what I expected to see, but certainly not that which met our eyes. "Your spear!" cried Harry, dashing off to the right, away from the stream. My spear was ready. I followed. Desiree was standing exactly in the spot where we had left her, screaming at the top of her voice. Around her, on every side, was a struggling, pushing mass of the animals we had frightened away from the carcass of the reptile. There were hundreds of them, packed tightly together, crowding toward her, some leaping on the backs of others, some trampled to the ground beneath the feet of their fellows. They did not appear to be actually attacking her, but we could not see distinctly. This we saw in a flash, and an instant later had dashed forward into the mass with whirling spears. It was a farce rather than a fight. We brought our spears down on the swarm of heads and backs without even troubling to take aim. They pressed against our legs. We waded through as though it were a current of water. Those we hit either fell or ran. They waited for no second blow. Desiree had ceased her cries. "They won't hurt you," Harry had shouted. "Where's your spear?" "Gone. They came on me before I had time to get it." "Then kick 'em, push 'em, anything. They're nothing but pigs." They had the senseless stubbornness of pigs, at least. They seemed absolutely unable to realize that their presence was not desired till they actually felt the spear, utterly devoid even of instinct. "So this is what you captured for us at the risk of your life," I shouted to Harry in disgust. "They haven't even sense enough to squeal." We finally reached Desiree's side and cleared a space round her. But it took us another 15 minutes of pushing and thrusting and indiscriminate massacre before we routed the brutes. When they did decide to go, they lost no time, but scampered away toward the water with a sliding, tumbling rush. "Gad!" exclaimed Harry, resting on his spear. "And here's a pretty job. Look at that. I wish they'd carry off the dead ones." "Ugh! The nasty brutes! I was never so frightened in my life," said Desiree. "You frightened us, all right," Harry retorted. "Utterly fungoed. I never ran so fast in my life. And all you had to do was shake your spear at 'em and say boo. I thought it was the roommate of our friend with the eyes." "Have I been eating those things?" Desiree demanded. Harry grinned. "Yes, and that isn't all. You'll continue to eat 'em as long as I'm the cook. Come on, Paul, it's a day's work." We dragged the bodies down to the edge of the stream and tossed them into the current, saving 3 or 4 for the replenishment of the larder. I then first tried my hand at the task of skinning and cleaning them, and by the time I had finished was thoroughly disgusted with it and myself. Harry had become hardened to it. He whistled over the job as though he had been born in a butcher's shop. "I'd rather go hungry," I declared, washing my hands and arms in the cool water. "Oh, sure," said Harry. "My efforts are never appreciated. I've fed you up till you've finally graduated from the skeleton class, and you immediately begin to criticize the table. I know now what it means to run a boarding house. Why don't you change your hotel?" By the time we had finished, we were pretty well tired out, but Harry wouldn't hear of rest. I was eager myself for another look at the exit of that stream. So, again taking up our spears, we set out across the cavern, this time with Desiree between us. She swallowed Harry's ridicule of her fear and refused to stay behind. Again we stood at the point where the stream left the cavern through the broad arch of a tunnel. "There's a chance there," said Harry, turning to me. "It looks good." "Yes, if we had a boat," I agreed. "But that's a 10-mile current, and probably deep." I waded out some 20 feet and was nearly swept beneath the surface as the water circled about my shoulders. "We couldn't follow that on our feet," I declared, returning to the shore. "But it does look promising. At 10 miles an hour we'd reach the western slope in 4 hours. 4 hours to sunshine, but it might as well be 400. It's impossible." We turned then and retraced our steps to our camp, if I may give it so dignified a title. I hated to give up the idea of following the bed of the stream, for it was certain that somewhere it found the surface of the earth, and I revolved in my brain every conceivable means to do so. The same thought was in Harry's mind, for he turned to me suddenly. "If we only had something for stringers, I could make a raft that would carry us to the Pacific and across it. The hide of that thing over yonder would be just the stuff, and we could get a piece as big as we wanted." I shook my head. "I thought of that, but we have absolutely nothing to hold it. There wasn't a bone in his body, you know that." But the idea was peculiarly tempting, and we spent an hour discussing it. Desiree was asleep on her pile of skins. We sat side by side on the ground some distance away, talking in low tones. Suddenly there was a loud splash in the stream, which was quite close to us. "By gad!" exclaimed Harry, springing to his feet. "Did you hear that? It sounded like remember the fish we pulled in from the Inca's raft?" "Which has nothing to do with this," I answered. "It's nothing but the water pigs. I've heard 'em 1,000 times in the last few days, and the Lord knows we have enough of them." But Harry protested that the splash was much too loud to have been caused by any water pig, and waded into the stream to investigate. I rose to my feet and followed him leisurely, for no reason in particular, but was suddenly startled by an excited cry from his lips. "Paul! The spear! Quick! It's a whale!" I ran as swiftly as I could to the shore and returned with our spears, but when I reached Harry he greeted me with an oath of disappointment and the information that the whale had disappeared. He was greatly excited. "I tell you, he was 20 feet long. A big black devil with a head like a cow." "You're sure it wasn't like a pig?" I asked, skeptically. Harry looked at me. "I have drunk nothing but water for a month," he said dryly. "It was a fish, and some fish." "Well, there's probably more like him," I observed, "but they can wait. Come on and get some sleep, and then we'll see." Some hours afterward, having filled ourselves with sleep and food, I had decided after mature deliberation not to change my hotel. We started out, armed with our spears. Desiree accompanied us. Harry told her bluntly that she would be in the way, but she refused to stay behind. We turned upstream, thinking our chances better in that direction than toward the swifter current, and were surprised to find that the cavern was much larger than any we had before seen. In something over a mile we had not yet reached the farther wall, for we walked at a brisk pace for a quarter of an hour or more. At this point the stream was considerably wider than it was below, and there was very little current. Desiree stood on the bank, while Harry and I waded out above our waists. There was a long and weary wait before anything occurred. The water was cold, and my limbs became stiff and numb. I called to Harry that it was useless to wait longer, and was turning toward the shore, when there was a sudden commotion in the water not far from where he stood. I turned and saw Harry plunge forward with his spear. "I've got him!" he yelled. "Come on!" I went. But I soon saw that Harry didn't have him. He had Harry. They were all of 10 yards away from me, and by the time I reached the spot there was nothing to be seen but flying water thrashed into foam and fury. I caught a glimpse of Harry being jerked through the air. He was holding on for dear life with both hands to the shaft of his spear. The water was over my head there. I was swimming with all the strength I had. "I've got him! Through the belly!" Harry gasped as I fought my way through the spray to his side. "His head! Find his head!" I finally succeeded in getting my hand on Harry's spear shaft near where it entered the body of the fish, but the next instant it was jerked from me, dragging me beneath the surface. I came up puffing and made another try, but missed it by several feet. Harry kept shouting, "His head! Get him in the head!" For that I was saving my spear. But I could make nothing of either head or tail as the immense fish leaped furiously about in the water, first this way, then that. Once he came down exactly on top of me and carried me far under. I felt his slippery, smooth body glide over me, and the tail struck me a heavy blow in the face as it passed. Blinded and half choked, I fought my way back to the surface and saw that they had got 50 feet away. I swam to them, breathing hard and nearly exhausted. The water foamed less furiously about them now. As I came near, the fish leaped half out of the water and came down flat on his side. I saw his ugly black head pointed directly toward me. "He's about gone," Harry gasped. He was still clinging to the spear. I set myself firmly against the water and waited. Soon it parted violently, not 10 feet in front of me, and again the head appeared. He was coming straight for me. I could see the dull, beady eyes on either side, and I let him have the spear right between them. There was little force to the blow, but the fish himself furnished that. He was coming like lightning. I hurled my body aside with a great effort and felt him sweep past me. I turned to swim after them and heard Harry's great shout, "You got him!" By the time I reached him, the fish had turned over on his back and was floating on the surface, motionless. We had still to get him ashore, and, exhausted as we were, it was no easy task. But there was very little current, and after half an hour of pulling and shoving we got him into shallow water, where we could find the bottom with our feet. Then it was easier. Desiree waded out to us and lent a hand, and in another 10 minutes we had him high and dry on the rock. He was even larger than I had thought. No wonder Harry had called him, or one like him, a whale. It was all of 15 feet from his snout to the tip of his tail. The skin was dead black on top and mottled irregularly on the belly. As we sat sharpening the points of our spears on the rock, preparatory to skinning him, Desiree stood regarding the fish with unqualified approval. She turned to us. "Well, I'd rather eat that than those other nasty things." "Oh, that isn't what we want him for," said Harry, rubbing his finger against the edge of his spear point. "He's probably not fit to eat." "Then why all this trouble?" asked Desiree. "Dear lady, we expect to ride him home," said Harry, rising to his feet. Then he explained our purpose, and you may believe that Desiree was the most excited of the lot, as we ripped down the body of the fish from tail to snout and began to peel off the tough skin. "If you succeed, you may choose the new hangings for my boudoir," she said, with an attempt at lightness not altogether successful. "As for me," I declared, "I shall eat fish every day of my life out of pure gratitude." "You'll do it out of pure necessity," Harry put in, "if you don't get busy." It took us 3 hours of whacking and slashing and tearing to pull the fish to pieces, but we worked with a purpose and a will. When we had finished, this is what we had to show: a long strip of bone, 4 inches thick and 12 feet long, and tough as hickory, from either side of which the smaller bones projected at right angles. They were about 1 inch in thickness and 2 inches apart. The lower end of the backbone, near the tail, we had broken off. We examined it and lifted it and bent it half double. "Absolutely perfect!" Harry cried in jubilation. "3 more like this and we'll sail down the coast to Callao." "If we can get 'em," I observed. "But 2 would do. We could make it a triangle." Harry looked at me. "Paul, you're an absolute genius. But would it be big enough to hold us?" We discussed that question on our way back to camp, whither we carried the backbone of our fish, together with some of the meat. Then, after a hearty meal, we slept. After 7 hours of the hardest kind of work, we were ready for it. That was our program for the time that followed, time that stretched into many weary hours, for once started, we worked feverishly, so impatient had we become by dint of that faint glimmer of hope. We were going to try to build a raft, on which we were going to try to embark on the stream, by which we were going to try to find our way out of the mountain. The prospect made us positively hilarious, so slender is the thread by which hope jerks us about. The first part of our task was the most strenuous. We waited and waited around many hours before another fish appeared, and then he got away from us. Another attempt was crowned with success after a hard fight. The second one was even larger than the first. The next 2 were too small to be of use in the raft, but we saved them for another purpose. Then, after another long search, lasting many hours, we ran into half a dozen of them at once. By that time we were fairly expert with our spears, besides having discovered their vulnerable spot, the throat, just forward from the gills. To this day I don't know whether or not they were man-eaters. Their jaws were roomy and strong as those of any shark, but they never closed on us. Thus we had 4 of the large backbones and 2 smaller ones. Next we wanted a covering, and for that purpose we visited the remains of the reptile which had first led us into the cavern. Its hide was 1/2 inch thick, and tough as the toughest leather. There was no difficulty in loosening it, for by that time the flesh was so decayed and sunken that it literally fell off. That job was the worst of all. Time and again, after cutting away with the points of our spears, our only tools, until we could stand it no longer, we staggered off to the stream like drunken men, sick and faint with the sight and smell of the mess. But that too came to an end, and finally we marched off to the camp, which we had removed a half-mile upstream, dragging after us a piece of the hide about 30 feet long and half as wide. It was not as heavy as we had thought, which made it all the better for our purpose. The remainder of our task, though tedious, was not unpleasant. We first made the larger bones, which were to serve as the beams of our craft, exactly the same length by filing off the ends of the longer ones with rough bits of granite. I have said it was tedious. Then we filed off each of the smaller bones projecting from the neural arch until they were of equal length. They extended on either side about 10 inches, which, allowing 4 inches for the width of the larger bone, and 1 inch for the covering would make our raft slightly over a foot in depth. To make the cylindrical column rigid, we bound each of the vertebrae to the one in direct juxtaposition on either side firmly with strips of hide, several 100 feet of which we had prepared. This gave us 4 beams held straight and true, without any play in either direction, with only a slight flexibility resulting from the cartilages within the center cord. With these 4 beams we formed a square, placing them on their edges end to end. At each corner of the square we lashed the ends together firmly with strips of hide. It was both firm and flexible after we had lashed the corners over and over with the strips, that there might be no play under the strain of the current. Over this framework we stretched the large piece of hide so that the ends met on top, near the middle. The bottom was thus absolutely watertight. We folded the corners in and caught them up with strips over the top. Then, with longer strips, we fastened up the sides, passing the strips back and forth across the top, from side to side, having first similarly secured the 2 ends. As a final precaution, we passed broader strips around both top and bottom, lashing them together in the center of the top. And there was our raft, 12 feet square, over a foot deep, watertight as a town drunkard, and weighing not more than 100 pounds. It has taken me 2 minutes to tell it. It took us 2 weeks to do it. But we discovered immediately that the 4 beams on the sides and ends were not enough, for Desiree's weight alone caused the skin to sag clear through in the center, though we had stretched it as tightly as possible. We were forced to unlash all the strips running from side to side and insert supports, made of smaller bones, across the middle each way. These we reinforced on their ends with the thickest hide we could find, that they might not puncture the bottom. After that it was fairly firm. Though its seaworthiness was not improved, it was much easier to navigate than it would have been before. For oars we took the lower ends of the backbones of the 2 smaller fish and covered them with hide. They were about 5 feet long and quite heavy, but we intended to use them more for the purpose of steering than for propulsion. The current of the stream would attend to that for us. Near the center of the raft we arranged a pile of the skins of the water pigs for Desiree, a seat by no means uncomfortable. The strips which ran back and forth across the top afforded a hold as security against the tossing of the craft. But for her feet we arranged 2 other strips to pass over her ankles what time she rested. This was an extreme precaution, for we did not expect the journey to be a long one. Finally we loaded on our provisions, about 30 pounds of the meat of the fish and water pigs, wrapping it securely in 2 or 3 of the skins and strapping them firmly to the top. "And now," said I, testing the strips on the corners for the last time, "all we need is a name for her and a bottle of wine." "And a homeward-bound pennant," put in Harry. "The name is easy enough," said Desiree. "I hereby christen her Clarte du Soleil." "Which means?" asked Harry, whose French came only in spots. "Sunshine," I told him, "presumably after the glorious king of the Incas, who calls himself the child of the sun. But it's a good name. May heaven grant that it takes us there." "I think we ought to take more grub," said Harry, an observation which he had made not less than 50 times in the preceding 50 minutes. He received no support, and grumbled to himself something about the horrible waste of leaving so much behind. Why it was I don't know, but we were fully persuaded that we were about to say good-bye forever to this underground world and its dangers. Somehow we had coaxed ourselves into the belief that success was certain. It was as though we had seen the sunlight streaming in from the farther end of the arched tunnel into which the stream disappeared. There was an assurance about the words of each that strengthened this feeling in the others, and hope had shut out all thought of failure as we prepared to launch our craft. It took us some time to get it to the edge of the water, though it was close by, for we handled it with extreme care, that it might not be torn on the rocks. Altogether, with the provisions, it weighed close to 150 pounds. We were by no means sure that the thing would carry us, and when once we had reached the water, we forgot caution in our haste to try it. We held it at the edge, while Desiree arranged herself on the pile of skins. The spears lay across at her feet, strapped down for security. Harry stepped across to the farther edge of the raft. "Ready," he called, and I shoved off, wading behind. When the water was up to my knees, I climbed aboard and picked up my oar. "By all the 9 gods, look at her!" cried Harry in huge delight. "She takes about 3 inches. Man, she'd carry an army." "Allons!" cried Desiree with gay laughter. "C'est perfection!" "Couldn't be better," I agreed. "But watch yourself, Hal. When we get into the current, things are going to begin to happen. If it weren't for the beastly darkness, 'twould be easy enough. As it is, one little rock the size of your head could send us to the bottom." We were still near the bank, working our way out slowly. Harry and I had to maintain positions equidistant from the center in order to keep the raft balanced. Hence I had to push her out alone. Considering her bulk, she answered to the oar very well. Another 5 minutes and we were near the middle of the stream. At that point there was but little current, and we drifted slowly. Harry went to the bow, while I took up a position on the stern, if I may use such terms for such a craft, directly behind Desiree. We figured that we were then about a mile from the point where the stream left the cavern. Gradually, as the stream narrowed, the strength of the current increased. Still it was smooth, and the raft sailed along without a tremor. Once or twice, caught by some trick of the current, she turned half round, poking her nose ahead, but she soon righted herself. The water began to curl up on the sides as we were carried more and more swiftly onward, with a low murmur that was music to us. The stream became so narrow that we could see the bank on either side, though dimly, and I knew we were approaching the exit. I called to Harry, "Keep her off to the right as we make the turn," and he answered, "Aye, aye, sir," with a wave of the hand. This, at least, was action with a purpose. Another minute and we saw the arch directly ahead of us, round a bend in the stream. The strength of the current carried us toward the off bank, but we plied our oars desperately and well, and managed to keep fairly well in to the end of the curve. We missed the wall of the tunnel, black, grim rock that would have dashed out our brains, by about 10 feet, and were swept forward under the arch, on our way, so we thought, to the land of sunshine. End of chapter 19. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 20 of Under the Andes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Under the Andes by Rex Stout. Chapter 20. An Inca Spear. Here I might most appropriately insert a paragraph on the vanity of human wishes and endeavor. But events, they say, speak for themselves, and still, for my own part, I prefer the philosopher to the historian. Mental digestion is a wearisome task. You are welcome to it. To the story. As I have said, we missed the wall of the tunnel by a scant 10 feet, and we kept on missing it. Once under the arch, our raft developed a most stubborn inclination to bump up against the rocky banks, instead of staying properly in the middle of the current as it should. First to one side, then to the other it swung, while Harry and I kept it off with our oars, often missing a collision by inches. But at least the banks were smooth and level, and as long as the stream itself remained clear of obstruction, there was but little real danger. The current was not nearly so swift as I had expected it would be. In the semi-darkness it was difficult to calculate our rate of speed, but I judged that we were moving at about 6 or 7 miles an hour. We had gone perhaps 3 miles when we came to a sharp bend in the stream, to the left, almost at a right angle. Harry, at the bow, was supposed to be on the lookout, but he failed to see it until we were already caught in its whirl. Then he gave a cry of alarm, and together we swung the raft to the left, avoiding the right bank of the curve by less than a foot. Once safely past, I sent Harry to the stern and took the bow myself, which brought down upon him a deal of keen banter from Desiree. There the tunnel widened, and the raft began to glide easily onward, without any of its sudden dashes to right or left. I rested on my oar, gazing intently ahead. At the best, I could make out the walls 100 yards ahead, and but dimly. All was silence, save the gentle swish of the water against the sides of the raft, and the patter of Harry's oar dipping idly on one side or the other. Suddenly Desiree's voice came through the silence, soft and very low. Pendant une année toute entière, le régiment n'a pas reparu. Au ministère de la guerre, on le rapporte comme perdu. On se renonçait à trouver sa trace, quand du matin subitement, on le vit reparaître sur la place, le colonel toujours en avant. I waited until the last note had died away in the darkness. "Are those your thoughts?" I asked then, half turning. "No," said Desiree, "but I want to kill my thoughts. As for them—" She hesitated, and after a short pause her voice again broke into melody. "Fresh as the first beam glittering on a sail that brings our friends up from the underworld, sad as the last which reddens over me, that sinks with all we love below the verge, so sad, so fresh the days that are no more." Her voice, subdued and low, breathed a sweetness that seemed almost to be of another world. My ear quivered with the vibrations, and long after she was silent the last mellow note floated through my brain. Suddenly I became conscious of another sound, scarcely less musical. It, too, was low, so low and faint that at first I thought my ear deceived me, or that some distant echo was returning Desiree's song down the dark tunnel. Gradually, very gradually, it became louder and clearer, until at length I recognized it. It was the rush of water, unbroken, still low and at a great distance. I turned to remark on it to Harry, but Desiree took the words from my mouth. "I seem to hear something, like the surf," she said. "That isn't possible, is it?" I could have smiled but for the deep note of hope in her voice. "Hardly," I answered. "I have heard it for several minutes. It is probably some shallows. We must look sharp." Another 15 minutes, and I began to notice that the speed of the current was increasing. The sound of the rushing water, too, was quite distinct. Still the raft moved more and more swiftly, till I began to feel alarmed. I turned to Harry. "That begins to sound like rapids. See that the spears are fastened securely, and stand ready with your oar. Sit tight, Desiree." One thing was certain. There was nothing to do but go ahead. On both sides the walls of the tunnel rose straight up from the surface of the water. There was nowhere room for a landing place, not even a foot for a purchase to stay our flight. To go back was impossible. At the rate the current was now carrying us, we could not have held the raft even for a moment without oars. Soon we were gliding forward so swiftly that the raft trembled under us. From the darkness ahead came the sound of the rapids, now increased to a roar that filled the tunnel and deafened us. I heard Harry shouting something, but could not make out the words. We were shooting forward with the speed of an express train, and the air about us was full of flying water. The roar of the rapids became louder and louder. I turned for an instant, shouting at the top of my voice, "Flat on your face, and hold on for dear life." Then I dropped down with my oar under me, passing my feet under two of the straps and clinging to two others with my hands. Another few seconds passed that seemed an hour. The raft was swaying and lurching with the mad force of the current. I called out again to Harry and Desiree, but my words were completely drowned by the deafening, stunning roar of the water. All was darkness and confusion. I kept asking myself, "Why doesn't it come?" It seemed an age since I had thrown myself on my face. Suddenly the raft leaped up under me and away. It seemed as though some giant hand had grasped it from beneath and jerked it down with tremendous force. The air was filled with water, lashing my face and body furiously. The raft whirled about like a cork. I gripped the straps with all the strength that was in me. Down, down we went into the darkness. My breath was gone, and my brain whirled dizzily. There was a sudden sharp lurch, a jerk upward, and I felt the surface of the water close over me. Blinded and dazed, I clung to my hold desperately, struggling with the instinct to free myself. For several seconds the roar of the cataract sounded in my ears with a furious faintness, as though it were at a great distance. Then I felt the air again and a sudden cessation of motion. I opened my eyes, choking and sputtering. For a time I could see nothing. Then I made out Desiree's form and Harry's, stretched behind me on the raft. At the same instant Harry's voice came, "Paul! Oh, Desiree!" In another moment we were at her side. Her hands held to the straps on each side with a grip as of death. We had to pry off each of her fingers separately to loosen them. Then we bent her over Harry's knee, and worked her arms up and down, and soon her chest heaved convulsively, and her lungs freed themselves of the water they had taken. Presently she turned about. Her eyes opened, and she pressed her hands to her head. "Don't say, 'Where am I?'" said Harry, "because we don't know. How do you feel?" "I don't know," she answered, still gasping for breath. What was it? What did we do? I left them then, turning to survey the extent of our damage. There was absolutely none. We were as intact as when we started. The provisions and spears remained under their straps. My oar lay where I had fallen on it. The raft appeared to be floating easily as before, without a scratch. The water about us was churned into foam, though we had already been carried so far from the cataract that it was lost behind us in the darkness. Only its roar reached our ears. To this day I haven't the faintest idea of its height. It may have been 10 feet or 200. Harry says 1,000. We were moving slowly along on the surface of what appeared to be a lake, still carried forward by the force of the falls behind us. For my part, I found its roar bewildering and confusing, and I picked up my oar and commenced to paddle away from it. At least, so I judged. Harry's voice came from behind. "In the name of goodness, where did you get that oar?" I turned. "Young man, a good sailor never loses an oar. How do you feel, Desiree?" "Like a drowned rat," she answered, but with a laugh in her voice. "I'm faint and sick and wet, and my throat is ready to burst, but I wouldn't have missed that for anything. It was glorious. I'd like to do it again." "Yes, you would," said Harry skeptically. "You're welcome, thank you. But what I want to know is, where did that oar come from?" I explained that I had taken the precaution to fall on it. "Do you never lose your head?" asked Desiree. "No, merely my heart." "Oh, as for that," she retorted, with a lightness that still had a sting, "my good friend, you never had any." Whereupon I returned to my paddling in haste. Soon I discovered that though, as I have said, we appeared to be in a lake, for I could see no bank on either side, there was still a current. We drifted slowly, but our movement was plainly perceptible, and I rested on my oar. Presently a wall loomed up ahead of us, and I saw that the stream again narrowed down as it entered the tunnel, much lower than the one above the cataract. The current became swifter as we were carried toward its mouth, and I called to Harry to get his spear to keep us off from the walls, if it should prove necessary. But we entered exactly in the center and were swept forward with a rush. The ceiling of the tunnel was so low that we could not stand upright on the raft, and the stream was not more than 40 feet wide. That was anything but promising. If the stream really ran through to the western slope, its volume of water should have been increasing instead of diminishing. I said nothing of that to Harry or Desiree. We had sailed along thus without incident for upward of half an hour, when my carelessness, or the darkness, nearly brought us to grief. Suddenly, without warning, there was a violent jar, and the raft rebounded with a force that all but threw us into the water. Coming to a bend in the stream, the current had dashed us against the other bank. But, owing to the flexibility of its sides, the raft escaped damage. I had my oar against the wall instantly, shoving off, and we swung round and caught the current again round the curve. But that bend was to the left, as the other had been, which meant that we were now going in exactly the opposite direction of that in which we had started, which, in turn, meant the death of hope. We were merely winding in and out in a circle and getting nowhere. Harry and Desiree had apparently not noticed the fact, and I said nothing of it. Time enough when they should find out for themselves, and, besides, there was still a chance, though a slim one. Soon the bed of the stream became nearly level, for we barely moved. The roof of the tunnel was very low, but a scant foot above our heads as we sat or crouched on the raft. It was necessary to keep a sharp lookout ahead. A rock projecting from above would have swept us into the water. The air, too, was close and foul. Our breath became labored and difficult, and Desiree, half stifled and drowsy, passed into a fitful and broken sleep, stirring restlessly and panting for air. Harry had taken the bow, and I lay across the stern. Suddenly his voice came, announcing that we had left the tunnel. I sat up quickly and looked around. The walls were no longer to be seen. We had evidently entered a cavern similar to the one in which we had embarked. "Shall we lay off?" I asked, stepping across to Harry's side. He assented, and I took the oar and worked the raft over to the left. There was but little current, and she went well in. In a few minutes we were in shallow water, and Harry and I jumped off and shoved her to the bank. Desiree sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Where are we?" she asked. Harry explained while we beached the raft. Then we broke out our provisions and partook of them. "But why do we stop?" asked Desiree. The words, "because we are not getting anywhere," rose to my lips, but I kept them back. "For a rest and some air," I answered. Desiree exclaimed, "But I want to go on." So, as soon as we had eaten our fill, we loaded the stuff again and prepared to shove off. By that time, I think Harry, too, had realized the hopelessness of our expedition, for he had lost all his enthusiasm. But he said nothing, nor did I. We secured Desiree on her pile of skins and again pushed out into the current. The cavern was not large, for we had been under way but a few minutes, when its wall loomed up ahead, and the stream again entered a tunnel so low and narrow that I hesitated about entering at all. I consulted Harry. "Take a chance," he advised. "Why not? As well that as anything." We slipped through the entrance. The current was extremely sluggish, and we barely seemed to move. Still we went forward. "If we only had a little speed, we could stand it," Harry grumbled. Which shows that a man does not always appreciate a blessing. It was not long before we were offering up thanks that our speed had been so slight. To be exact, about an hour, as well as I could measure time, which passed slowly, for not only were the minutes tedious, but the foulness of the air made them also extremely uncomfortable. Desiree was again lying down, half unconscious but not asleep, for now and then she spoke drowsily. Harry complained of a dizziness in the head, and my own seemed ready to burst through my temples. The soroche of the mountains was agreeable compared to that. Suddenly the swiftness of the current increased appreciably on the instant. There was a swift jerk as we were carried forward. I rose to my knees, the tunnel was too low to permit of standing, and gazed intently ahead. I could see nothing save that the stream had narrowed to half its former width, and was still becoming narrower. We went faster and faster, and the stream narrowed until the bank was but a few feet away on either side. "Watch the stern!" I called to Harry. "Keep her off with your spear." Then a wall loomed up directly ahead. I thought it meant another bend in the stream, and I strained my eyes intently in the effort to discover its direction, but I could see nothing save the black wall. We approached closer. I shouted to Harry and Desiree to brace themselves for a shock, praying that the raft would meet the rock squarely and not on a corner. I had barely had time to set myself and grasp the straps behind when we struck with terrific force. The raft rebounded several feet, trembling and shaking violently. The water was rushing past us with noisy impetuosity. There was a cry from Desiree, and from Harry, "All right!" I crawled to the bow. Along the top, the hide covering had been split open for several feet, but the water did not quite reach the opening. And we had reached the end of our ambitious journey, for that black wall marked the finish of the tunnel. The stream entered it through a narrow hole, which accounted for the sudden, swift rush of the current. Above the upper rim of the hole, the surface of the water whirled about in a widening circle. To this had we been led by the stream that was to have carried us to the land of sunshine. When I told Desiree, she stared at me in silence. I had not realized before the strength of her hope. Speechless with disappointment, she merely sat and stared straight ahead, at the black, unyielding rock. Harry knelt beside her with his arm across her shoulders. I roused him with a jerk of the arm. "Come, get busy. A few hours in this hole and we'd suffocate. Do you realize that we've got to pull this raft back against the current? First, it was necessary to repair the rent in the hide covering. This we did with strips of hide, and barely in time, for it was becoming wider every minute, and the water was beginning to creep in over the edge. But we soon had the ends sewed firmly together, and turned our hands to the main task. It appeared to be not only difficult, but actually impossible to force the raft back upstream against the swift current. We were jammed against the rock with all the force of many tons of water. The oar was useless. Getting a purchase on the wall with our hands, we shoved the raft to one side, but as soon as we got to the wall on the left, the whirling stream turned us around again, and we found ourselves back in our original position, only with a different side of the raft against the rock. That happened 3 times. Then we tried working to the right instead of the left, but with no better success. The force of the current, coming with all its speed against the unwieldy raft, was irresistible. Time and again we shoved round and started upstream after incredible labor, only to be dashed back again against the rock. We tried our spears, but their shafts were so slender that they were useless. We took the oar and, placing its end against the wall, shoved with all our strength. The oar snapped in two, and we fell forward against the wall. We tore off some of the strips of hide from the raft and tried to fasten them to the wall on either side, but there was no protuberance that would hold them. Nothing remained to be done. Harry and I held a consultation then, and agreed on the only possible means of escape. I turned to Desiree. "Can you swim?" "Parfaitement," she replied. "But against that," pointing to the whirling water, "I do not know. I can try." I, who remember the black fury of that stream as it swept past us, can appreciate the courage of her. We lost no time, for the foulness of the air was weakening us with every breath we took. Our preparations were few. The 2 spears and about half of the provisions we strapped to our backs, an inconsiderable load which would hamper us but little. We discarded all our clothing, which was very little. I took the heavy skin which Desiree had worn and began to strap it also on top of my bundle, but she refused to allow it. "I will not permit you to be handicapped with my modesty," she observed. Then, with Desiree between us, we stepped to the edge of the raft and dived off together. Driven as we were by necessity, we would have hesitated longer if we had known the full force of the undercurrent that seized us from beneath. Desiree would have disappeared without a struggle, if it had not been for the support which Harry and I rendered her on either side. But we kept on top, most of the time, and fought our way forward by inches. The black walls frowning at us from either side appeared to me to remain exactly the same, stationary, after a long and desperate struggle, but when I gave a quick glance behind, I saw that we had pulled so far away from the raft that it was no longer in sight. That gave me renewed strength, and shouting assurance to Harry and Desiree, I redoubled my efforts. Desiree was by now almost able to hold her own, but we still supported her. Every stroke made the next one easier, carrying us away from the whirlpool, and soon we swam smoothly. Less and less strong became the resistance of the current, until finally it was possible to float easily on our backs and rest. "How far is it to the cavern?" Harry panted. "Somewhere between 1 and 10 miles," was my answer. "How the deuce should I know? But we'll make it now, I think. Can you hold out, Desiree?" "Easily," she answered. "If only I could get some air. Just one good long breath." There was the danger, and on that account no time was to be lost. Again we struck out into the blackness ahead. I felt myself no longer fresh, and began to doubt seriously if we should reach our goal. But we reached it. No need to recount our struggles, which toward the end were inspired by suffering amounting to agony, as we choked and gasped for sufficient air to keep us up. Another 100 yards would have been too much for us, but it is enough that finally we staggered onto the bank at the entrance to the cavern, in which we had previously rested, panting, dizzy, and completely exhausted. But an hour in the cavern, with its supply of air, revived us, and then we sat up and asked ourselves, "What for?" "And all that brings us to this?" said Harry, with a sweeping gesture round the cavern. "At least it is a better tomb," I retorted. "And it was a good fight. We still have something in us. Desiree, a good man was lost in you." Harry rose to his feet. "I'm going to look around," he announced. "We've got to do something. Gad, and it took us a month to build that raft." "The vanity of human endeavor," said I, loosening the strap round my shoulders and dropping my bundle to the ground. "Wait a minute. I'm going with you. Are you coming, Desiree?" But she was too tired to rise to her feet, and we left her behind, arranging what few skins we had as well as possible to protect her from the hard rock. "Rest your weary bones," said Harry, stooping to kiss her. "There's meat here if you want it. We'll be back soon." So we left her, with her white body stretched out at its full length on the rude mat. Bearing off to the left, we soon discovered that we would have no difficulty to leave the cavern. We had only to choose our way. There was scarcely any wall at all, so broken was it by lanes and passages leading in all directions. We followed some of them for a distance, but found none that gave any particular promise. Most of them were choked with rocks and boulders through which it was difficult to force a passage. We spent an hour or more in these futile explorations, then followed the wall some distance to the right. Gradually the exits became less numerous. High on a boulder near the entrance of one, we saw the head of some animal peering down at us. We hurled our spears at it, but missed. Then were forced to climb up the steep side of the boulder to recover our weapons. "We'd better go back to Desiree," said Harry when we reached the ground again. "She'll wonder what's become of us. We've been gone nearly 2 hours." After 15 minutes' search we found the stream and followed it to the left. We had gone farther than we thought, and we were looking for the end, where we had left Desiree, long before we reached it. Several times we called her name, but there was no answer. "She's probably asleep," said Harry. And a minute later, "There's the wall at last. But where is she?" My foot struck something on the ground, and I stooped over to examine it. It was the pile of skins on which Desiree had lain. I called to Harry, and at the same instant heard his shout of consternation as he came running toward me, holding something in his hand. "They've got her! Look at this! I found it on the ground over there." He held the thing in his hand out before me. It was an Inca spear. End of chapter 20. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 21 of Under the Andes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Under the Andes by Rex Stout. Chapter 21. The Midst of the Enemy. Harry and I stood gazing at each other blankly in the semi-darkness of the cavern. "But it isn't possible," I objected finally to my own thoughts. "She would have cried out, and we would have heard her. The spear may have been there before." Then I raised my voice, calling her name many times at the top of my lungs. There was no answer. "They've got her," said Harry, "and that's all there is to it. The cursed brutes crept up on her in the dark. Much chance she had of crying out when they got their hands on her. I know it. Why did we leave her?" "Where did you find the spear?" I asked. Harry pointed toward the wall, away from the stream. "On the ground?" "Yes." "Is there an exit from the cavern on that side?" "I don't know." "Well, that's our only chance. Come on." We found the exit, and another, and a third. Which to take? They were very similar to one another, except that the one in the middle sloped upward at a gentle incline, while the others were level. "One is as good as another," I observed, and entered the one on the left. Once started, we advanced with a rush. The passage was straight and narrow, clear of obstruction, and we kept at a steady run. "They may have an hour's start of us," came Harry's voice at my side. "Or 5 minutes. I returned. "We have no way of knowing, but I'm afraid we're on the wrong trail." Still, as I had said, one chance was as good as another, and we did not slacken our pace. The passage went straight forward, without a bend. The roof was low, just allowing us to pass without stooping, and the walls were rough and rugged. It was not long before we found that we had taken the wrong chance, having covered, I think, some 2 or 3 miles, when a wall loomed up directly in our path. "At last, a turn!" panted Harry. But it was not a turn; it was the end of the passage. We had been following a blind alley. Harry let out a string of oaths, and I seconded him. 20 minutes wasted, and another 20 to return. There was nothing else for it. We shouldered our spears and started to retrace our steps. "No use running now," I declared. "We can't keep it up forever, and we may as well save our strength. We'll never catch up with them, but we may find 'em." Harry, striding ahead 2 or 3 paces in front, did not answer. Finally we reached the cavern from which we had started. "And now what?" asked Harry in a tone of the most utter dejection. I pointed to the exit in the middle. "That. We should have taken it in the first place. On the raft we probably descended altogether something like 500 feet from the level where we started, possibly twice that distance. And this passage which slopes upward will probably take us back." "At least it's as good as the other," Harry agreed, and we entered it. We had not proceeded far before we found ourselves in difficulties. The gentle slope became a steep incline. Great rocks loomed up in our path. In spots the passage was so narrow that 2 men could hardly have walked abreast through it, and its walls were rough and irregular, with sharp points projecting unexpectedly into our very faces. Still we went forward and upward, scrambling over, under, round, between. At one point, when Harry was a few yards in front of me, he suddenly disappeared from sight as though swallowed by the mountain. Rushing forward, I saw him scrambling to his feet at the bottom of a chasm some 10 feet below. Luckily he had escaped serious injury, and climbed up on the other side, while I leaped across, a distance of about 6 feet. "They could never have brought her through this," he declared, rubbing a bruised knee. "Do you want to go back?" I asked. But he said that would be useless, and I agreed with him. So we struggled onward, painfully and laboriously. The sharp corners of the rocks cut our feet and hands, and I had an ugly bruise on my left shoulder, besides many lesser ones. Harry's injured knee caused him to limp, and thus further retarded our progress. At times the passage broadened out until the wall on either side was barely visible, only to narrow down again till it was scarcely more than a crevice between the giant boulders. The variation of the incline was no less, being at times very nearly level, and at others mounting upward at an angle whose ascent was all but impossible. Somehow we crawled up, like flies on a wall. When we came to a stream of water rushing directly across our path at the foot of a towering rock, Harry gave out a cry of joy and ran forward. I had not known until then how badly his knee was hurt, and when I came up to where he was bathing it in the stream and saw how black and swollen it was, I insisted that he give it a rest. But he absolutely refused, and after we had quenched our thirst and gotten an easy breath or two, we struggled to our feet and on. After another hour of scrambling and failing and hanging on by our fingernails, the way began to be easier. We came to level, clear stretches with only an occasional boulder or ravine, and the rock became less cruel to our bleeding feet. The relief came almost too late, for by that time every movement was painful, and we made but slow progress. Soon we faced another difficulty when we came to a point where a split in the passage showed a lane on either side. One led straight ahead, the other branched off to the right. They were very similar, but somehow the one on the right looked more promising to us, and we took it. We had followed this but a short distance, when it broadened out to such an extent that the walls on either side could be seen but dimly. It still sloped upward, but at a very slight angle, and we had little difficulty in making our way. Another half hour and it narrowed down again to a mere lane. We were proceeding at a fairly rapid gait, keeping our eyes strained ahead, when there appeared an opening in the right wall at a distance of 100 feet or so. Not having seen or heard anything to recommend caution, we advanced without slackening our pace until we had reached it. I said aloud to Harry, "Probably a cross passage," and then jerked him back quickly against the opposite wall, as I saw the real nature of the opening. It led to a small room, with a low ceiling and rough walls, dark as the passage in which we stood, for it contained no light. We could see its interior dimly, but well enough to discover the form of an Inca standing just within the doorway. His back was toward us, and he appeared to be fastening something to the ceiling with strips of hide. It was evident that we had not been seen, and I started to move on, grasping Harry's arm. It was then that I became aware of the fact that the wall leading away in front of us, that is, the one on the right, was marked as far as the eye could reach with a succession of similar openings. They were quite close together. From where we stood I could see 30 or 40 of them. I guessed that they too led to rooms similar to the one in front of us, probably likewise occupied, but it was necessary to go in spite of the danger, and I pulled again at Harry's arm. Then, seeing by his face that something had happened, I turned my eyes again on the Inca in the room. He had turned about, squarely facing us. As we stood motionless, he took a hasty step forward. We had been discovered. There was but one thing to do, and we didn't hesitate about doing it. We leaped forward together, crossing the intervening space in a single bound, and bore the Inca to the floor under us. My fingers were round his throat. Harry sat on him. In a trice we had him securely bound and gagged, using some strips of hide which we found suspended from the ceiling. "By gad!" exclaimed Harry in a whisper. "Look at him. He's a woman." It was quite evident, disgustingly so. Her eyes, dull and sunken, appeared as two large black holes set back in her skull. Her hair, matted about her forehead and shoulders, was thick and coarse, and blacker than night. Her body was innocent of any attempt at covering. Altogether not a very pleasant sight, and we bundled her into a corner and proceeded to look around the room, being careful to remain out of the range of view from the corridor as far as possible. The room was not luxuriously furnished. There were 2 seats of stone and a couch of the same material covered with thick hides. In one corner was a pile of copper vessels, in another 2 or 3 of stone, rudely carved. Some torn hides lay in a heap near the center of the room. From the ceiling were suspended other hides and some strips of dried fish. Some of the latter we cut down with the points of our spears and retired with it to a corner. "Ought we to ask our hostess to join us?" Harry grinned. "This tastes good, after the other," I remarked. Hungry as we were, we made sad havoc with the ladies' pantry. Then we found some water in a basin in the corner and drank, not without misgivings. But we were too thirsty to be particular. Then Harry became impatient to go on, and though I had no liking for the appearance of that long row of open doorways, I did not demur. Taking up our spears, we stepped out into the corridor and turned to the right. We found ourselves running a gantlet wherein discovery seemed certain. The right wall was one unbroken series of open doorways, and in each of the rooms, whose interiors we could plainly see, were one or more of the Inca women, and sometimes children rolled about on the stony floor. In one of them a man stood. I could have sworn that he was gazing straight at us, and I gathered myself together for a spring, but he made no movement of any kind, and we passed swiftly by. Once a little black ball of flesh, a boy it was, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, tumbled out into the corridor under our very feet. We strode over him and went swiftly on. We had passed about 100 of the open doorways, and were beginning to entertain the hope that we might, after all, get through without being discovered, when Harry suddenly stopped short, pulling at my arm. At the same instant I saw, far down the corridor, a crowd of black forms moving toward us. Even at that distance, something about their appearance and gait told us that they were not women. Their number was so great that, as they advanced, they filled the passage from wall to wall. There was but one way to escape certain discovery, and, distasteful as it was, we did not hesitate to employ it. In a glance I saw that we were directly opposite an open doorway. With a whispered word to Harry, I sprang across the corridor and within the room. He followed. Inside were a woman and 2 children. As we entered they looked up, startled, and stood gazing at us in terror. For an instant we held back, but there was nothing else for it, and in another minute we had overpowered and bound and gagged them and carried them to a corner. The children were ugly little devils, and the woman very little above a brute. Still we handled them as tenderly as possible. Then we crouched against the wall where we could not be seen from the corridor, and waited. Soon the patter of many footsteps reached our ears. They passed. Others came, and still others. For many minutes the sound continued steadily, unbroken, while we sat huddled up against the wall, scarcely daring to breathe. Immediately in front of me lay the forms of the woman and the children. I could see their dull eyes, unblinking, looking up at me in abject terror. Still the patter of footsteps sounded from without, and now and then an interval of quiet. Struck by a sudden thought, I signaled to Harry, and when he had moved further back into his corner, I sprang across the room in one bound to his side. A word or two of whispering, and he nodded to show that he understood. We crouched together flat against the wall. My thought had come just in time, for scarcely another minute had passed when there suddenly appeared in the doorway the form of an Inca. He moved a step inside, and I saw that there was another behind him. I had not counted on 2 of them. In the arms of each was a great copper vessel, evidently very heavy, for their effort was apparent as they stooped to place the vessels on the ground just within the doorway. As they straightened up and saw that the room before them was empty, their faces filled with surprise. At the same moment a movement came from the woman in the corner. The 2 men glanced at them with a start of wonder, and as I had foreseen, they ran across and bent over the prostrate forms. The next instant they too were prone on the floor, with Harry and me on top of them. They did not succumb without a struggle, and the one I had chosen proved nearly too much for me. The great muscles of his chest and legs strained under me with a power that made me doubtful for a moment of the outcome. But the Incas themselves had taught us how to conquer a man when you attack him from behind, and I grasped his throat with all the strength there was in my fingers. With a desperate effort he got to his knees and grasped my wrists in his powerful black hands and tore my own grip loose. He was halfway to his feet, and far more powerful than I. I changed my tactics. Wrenching myself loose, I fell back a step, then, as he twisted round to get at me, I lunged forward and let him have my fist squarely between the eyes. The blow nearly broke my hand, but he dropped to the floor. The next instant I was joined by Harry, who had overcome the other Inca with little difficulty, and in a trice we had them both bound and gagged along with the remainder of the family in the corner. Owing to my strategy in withholding our attack until the Incas had got well within the room and to one side, we had not been seen by those constantly passing up and down in the corridor without. At least, none of them had entered. We seemed by this stroke to have assured our safety so long as we remained in the room. But it was still necessary to remain against the wall, for the soft patter of footsteps could still be heard in the corridor. They now came at irregular intervals, and there were not many of them. Otherwise, the silence was unbroken. "What does it all mean?" Harry whispered. "The Incas are coming home to their women," I guessed. "Though after seeing the women, it is little wonder if they spend most of their time away from them. He is welcome to his repose in the bosom of his family." There passed an uneventful hour. Long before it ended the sound of footsteps had entirely ceased. But we thought it best to take no chances, and waited for the last minute our impatience would allow us. Then, uncomfortable and stiff from the long period of immobility and silence, we rose to our feet and made ready to start. Harry was for appropriating some of the strips of dried fish we saw suspended from the ceiling, but I objected that our danger lay in any direction other than that of hunger, and we set out with only our spears. The corridor was deserted. One quick glance in either direction assured us of that. Then we turned to the right and set out at a rapid pace, down the long passage past a succession of rooms exactly similar to the one we had just left. Scores, hundreds of them. Each one was occupied by from 1 to 10 of the Incas lying on the couch which each contained, or stretched on hides on the floor. No one was stirring. Everywhere was silence save the patter of our own feet, which we let fall as noiselessly as possible. "Will it ever end?" whispered Harry at length, after we had traversed upward of a mile without any sign of a cross passage or a termination. "Forward and silence," I breathed for a reply. The end, at least of the silence, came sooner than we had expected. Hardly were the last words out of my mouth when a whirring noise sounded behind us. We glanced over our shoulders as we ran, and at the same instant an Inca spear flew by not 2 inches from my head and struck the ground in front. Not 100 feet to the rear we saw a group of Incas rushing along the passage toward us. Harry wheeled about, raising his spear, but I grasped him by the arm, crying, "Run! It's our only chance!" The next moment we were leaping forward side by side down the passage. It would have fared ill with any who appeared to block our way in that mad dash, but it remained clear. The corridor led straight ahead, with never a turn. We were running as we had never run before. The black walls flashed past us in an indistinguishable blur, and the open doorways were blended into one. Glancing back over my shoulder, I saw that the small group of Incas was no longer small. Away to the rear the corridor was filled with rushing black forms. But I saw plainly that we were gaining on them. The distance that separated us was twice as great as when we had first started to run. "How about it?" I panted. "Can you hold out?" "If it weren't for this knee," Harry returned between breaths and through clenched teeth. "But I'm with you." He was limping painfully, and I slackened my pace a little, but he urged me forward with an oath, and himself sprang to the front. His knee must have been causing him the keenest agony. His face was white as death. Then I uttered a cry of joy as I saw a bend in the passage ahead. We reached it and wheeled to the right. There was solid wall on either side. The series of doors was ended. "We'll shake 'em off now," I panted. Harry nodded. A short distance ahead we came to another cross passage and turned to the left. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw that our pursuers had not yet reached the first turn. Harry kept in the lead and was giving me all I could do to keep up with him. We found ourselves now in a veritable maze of lanes and cross passages, and we turned to one side or the other at every opportunity. At length I grasped Harry by the arm and stopped him. We stood for 2 full minutes, listening intently. There was absolutely no sound of any kind. "Thank heaven!" Harry breathed, and would have fallen to the ground if I had not supported him. We started out then in search of water, moving slowly and cautiously. But we found none, and soon Harry declared that he could go no further. We sat down with our backs against the wall of the passage, still breathing heavily and all but exhausted. In that darkness and silence the minutes passed into hours. We talked but little, and then only in whispers. Finally Harry fell into a restless sleep, if it may be called that, and several times I dozed off and was awakened by my head nodding against the stone wall. At length, finding Harry awake, I urged him to his feet. His knee barely supported his weight, but he gritted his teeth and told me to lead on. "We can wait," I began, but he broke in savagely, "No! I want to find her, that's all, and end it. Just one more chance." We searched for an hour before we found the stream of water we sought. After Harry had bathed his knee and drunk his fill he felt more fit, and we pushed on more rapidly, but still quite at random. We turned first one way, then another, in the never-ending labyrinth, always in darkness and silence. We seemed to get nowhere, and I for one was about to give up the disheartening task, when suddenly a sound smote our ears that caused us first to start violently, then stop and gaze at each other in comprehension and eager surprise. "The bell!" cried Harry. "They are being summoned to the great cavern." It was the same sound we had heard twice before, a sound as of a great, deep-toned bell ringing sonorously throughout the passages and caverns with a roar that was deafening. And it seemed to be close, quite close. "It came from the left," said Harry, but I disagreed with him, and was so sure of myself that we started off to the right. The echoes of the bell were still floating from wall to wall as we went rapidly forward. I do not know what we expected to find, and the Lord knows what we intended to do after we found it. A short distance ahead we came to another passage, crossing at right angles, broad and straight, and somehow familiar. As with one impulse we took it, turning to the left, and then flattened ourselves back against the wall as we saw a group of Incas passing at its farther end, some 200 yards away. There we stood, motionless and scarcely breathing, while group after group of the savages passed in the corridor ahead. Their number swelled to a continuous stream, which in turn gradually became thinner and thinner until only a few stragglers were seen trotting behind. Finally they too ceased to appear. The corridor was deserted. We waited a while longer, then as no more appeared, we started forward, and soon had reached the corridor down which they had passed. We followed in the direction they had taken, turning to the right. We had no sooner turned than we saw that which caused us to glance quickly at each other and hasten our step, while I smothered the ejaculation that rose to my lips. The corridor in which we now found ourselves stretched straight ahead for a distance, then turned to one side, and the corner thus formed was flooded with a brilliant blaze of light. There was no longer any doubt of it. We were on our way to the great cavern. For a moment I hesitated, asking myself for what purpose we hastened on thus into the very arms of our enemies. Then, propelled by instinct or premonition, I know not what, I took a firmer grasp on my spear and followed Harry without word, throwing caution to the winds. Yet we avoided foolhardiness, for as we approached the last turn we proceeded slowly, keeping an eye on the rear. But all the Incas appeared to have assembled within, for the corridor remained deserted. We crept silently to the corner, avoiding the circle of light as far as possible, and crouching side by side on the rock, looked out together on a scene none the less striking because we had seen it twice before. It was the great cavern. We saw it from a different viewpoint than before. The alcove which held the golden throne was far off to our left, nearly halfway round the vast circumference. On the throne was seated the king, surrounded by guards and attendants. As before, the stone seats which surrounded the amphitheater on every side were filled with the Incas, crouching motionless and silent. The flames in the massive urns mounted in steady tongues, casting their blinding glare in every direction. All this I saw in a flash, when suddenly Harry's fingers sank into the flesh of my arm with such force that I all but cried out in actual pain. And then, glancing at him and following the direction of his gaze, I saw Desiree. She was standing on the top of the lofty column in the center of the lake. Her white body, uncovered, was outlined sharply against the black background of the cavern above. End of chapter 21. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 22 of Under the Andes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Under the Andes by Rex Stout. Chapter 22. The Beginning of the End. Neither Harry nor I spoke. Our eyes were concentrated on the scene before us, trying to comprehend its meaning. It was something indefinable in Desiree's attitude that told me the truth. What, I cannot tell. Her profile was toward us. It could not have been her eyes or any expression of her face, but there was a tenseness about her pose, a stiffening of the muscles of her body, an air of lofty scorn and supreme triumph coming somehow from every line of her motionless figure, that flashed certainly into my brain. And on the instant I turned to Harry. "Follow me," I whispered, and he must have read the force of my knowledge in my eyes, for he obeyed without a word. Back down the passage we ran, halting at its end. Harry opened his lips to speak, but I took the words from his mouth. Seconds were precious. "They have fired the column, you remember. Follow me. Keep your spear ready. Not a sound, if you love her." I saw that he understood, and saw, too, by the expression that shot into his face, that it would go ill with any Incas who tried to stop us then. We rushed forward side by side, guessing at our way, seeking the entrance to the tunnel that led to the foot of the column. A prayer was on my lips that we might not be too late. Harry's lips were compressed together tightly as a vice. Death we did not fear, even for Desiree, but we remembered the horror of our own experience on the top of that column, and shuddered as we ran. As I have said, We had entered the great cavern at a point almost directly opposite the alcove, and therefore at a distance from the entrance we sought. It was necessary to half encircle the cavern, and the passages were so often crossed by other passages that many times we had to guess at the proper road. But not for an instant did we hesitate. We flew rather than ran. I felt within me the strength and resolve of 10 men, and I knew then that there was something I must do and would do before I died, though 1,000 devils stood in my way. I do not know what led us, whether a remorseful Providence, who suddenly decided that we had been played with long enough, or the mere animal instinct of direction, or blind luck. But so fast did we go that it seemed to me we had left the great cavern scarcely a minute behind us, when I suddenly saw the steps of a steep stairway leading down from an opening on our right. How my heart leaped then! Harry uttered a hoarse cry of exultation. The next instant we were dashing headlong down the steps, avoiding a fall by I know not what miracle. And there before us was the entrance to the tunnel. I held Harry back, almost shouting, "You stay here. Guard the entrance. I'll get her." "No," he cried, pushing forward. "I can't stay." "Fool!" I cried, dashing him back. "We would be caught like rats in a trap. Defend that entrance with your life." I saw him hesitate, and knowing that he would obey, I dashed forward into the tunnel. When nearly to its end I made a misstep on the uneven ground and precipitated myself against the wall. A sharp pain shot through my left shoulder, but at the time I was scarcely conscious of it, as I picked myself up and leaped forward. The end was in sight. Just as I reached the foot of the spiral stairway, I saw a black form descending from it. That Inca never knew what hit him. I did not use my spear. Time was too precious. He disappeared in the whirlpool beneath the base of the column through which Harry and I had once miraculously escaped. But despair filled my heart as, with my feet on the first step of the spiral stairway, I cast a quick glance upward. The upper half of the inside of the column was a raging furnace of fire. How or from what it came I did not stop to inquire. I bounded up the stairway in desperate fury. I did not know then that the stone steps were baking and blistering my feet. I did not know, as I came level with the base of the flames, that every hair was being singed from my head and body. I only knew that I must reach the top of the column. Then I saw the source of the flames as I reached them. Huge vats of oil, 6, a dozen, 20, I know not how many, were ranged in a circle on a ledge of stone encircling the column, and from their tops the fire leaped upward to a great height. I saw what must be done. How I did it, God only knows. I shut my eyes now as I remember it. Hooking the rim of the vat nearest me with the point of my spear, I sent it tumbling down the length of the column into the whirlpool, many feet below. Then another, and another, and another, until the ledge was empty. Some of the burning oil, flying from the overturned vats, alighted on the stairway, casting weird patches of light up and down the whole length of the column. Some of it landed on my body, my face, my hands. It was a very hell of heat. My lungs, all the inside of me, was on fire. My brain sang and whirled. My eyes felt as though they were being burned from their sockets with red-hot irons. I bounded upward. A few more steps, I could not see, I could hardly feel, and my head bumped against the stone at the top of the column. I put out my hand, groping around half crazily, and by some wild chance it came in contact with the slide that moved the stone slab. I pushed, hardly knowing what I did, and the stone flew to one side. I stuck my head through the opening and saw Desiree. Her back was toward me. As I emerged from the opening, The Incas seated round the vast amphitheater and the king, seated on the golden throne in the alcove, rose involuntarily from their seats in astonished wonder. Desiree saw the movement and, turning, caught sight of me. A sudden cry of amazement burst from her lips. She made a hasty step forward and fell fainting into my arms. I shook her violently, but she remained unconscious, and this added catastrophe all but unnerved me. For a moment I stood on the upper step, with the upper half of my body swaying from side to side, extending beyond the top of the column. Then I turned and began to descend with Desiree in my arms. Every step of that descent was unspeakable agony. Feeling was hardly in me. My whole body was an engine of pain. Somehow I staggered and stumbled downward. At every step I expected to fall headlong to the bottom with my burden. Desiree's form remained limp and lifeless in my arms. I reached the ledge on which the vats had been placed and passed it. Air entered my burning lungs like a breeze from the mountains. Every step now made the next one easier. I began to think that I might, after all, reach the bottom in safety. Another 20 steps, and I could see the beginning of the tunnel below. Desiree's form stirred slightly in my arms. A glance showed me her eyes looking up into mine as her head lay back on my shoulder. "Why?" she moaned. "In the name of heaven above us, why?" I had no time for answer. My lips were locked tightly together as I sought the step below with a foot that had no feeling even for the stone. We were nearly to the bottom. We reached it. I placed Desiree on her feet. "Can you stand?" I gasped, and the words were torn from my throat with a great effort. "But you!" she cried, and I saw that her eyes were filled with horror. No doubt I was a pitiful thing to look at. But there was no time to be lost, and seeing that her feet supported her, I grasped her arm and started down the tunnel just as Harry's voice, raised in a great shout, came to us from its farther end. "No!" cried Desiree, shrinking back in terror. "Paul!" I dragged her forward. Then, as Harry's cry was repeated, she seemed to understand and sprang forward beside me. Another second wasted, and we would have been too late. Just as we reached Harry's side, at the end of the tunnel, the Incas, warned by my appearance at the top of the column, appeared above on the stairway, at the foot of which Harry had made his stand. At the sight of Desiree, Harry uttered a cry of joy, then gazed in astonishment as I appeared behind her. "Run for your lives!" he shouted, pointing down the passage leading to the apartments beyond. As he spoke, a shower of spears descended from above, rattling on the steps and on the ground beside us. I stooped to pick up 2 of them, and as Desiree and I darted forward into the passage, with Harry bringing up the rear, the Incas dashed down the stairway after us. We found ourselves at once in the maze of lanes and passages leading to the royal apartments. That, I thought, was as good a goal as any, and besides, the way led to the cavern where we had once before successfully withstood our enemies. But the way was not so easy to find. Turn and twist about as we would, we could not shake off our pursuers. Harry kept urging me forward, but I was using every ounce of strength that was left to me. Desiree, too, was becoming weaker at every step, and I could hear Harry's cry of despair as she perceptibly faltered and slackened her pace. I soon realized that we were no longer in the passage, or group of passages, that led to the royal apartments and the cavern beyond. But there was no time to seek our way. Well enough if we went forward. We found ourselves in a narrow lane strewn with rocks, crooked and winding. Desiree stumbled and would have fallen but for my outstretched arm. A spear from behind whistled past my ear as we again bounded forward. Harry was shouting to us that the Incas were upon us. I caught Desiree's arm and pulled her on with a last great effort. The lane became narrower still. We brushed the wall on either side, and I pushed Desiree ahead of me and followed behind. Suddenly she stopped short, turning to face me so suddenly that I was thrown against her, nearly knocking her down. "Your spear!" she cried desperately. "I can go no farther," and she sank to the ground. At the same moment there came a cry from Harry in the rear, a cry that held joy and wonder, and I turned to see him standing some distance away, gazing down the lane through which we had come. "They've given up," he called. "They're gone." And I saw that it was true. No sound came, and no Inca was to be seen. Then, seeing Desiree on the ground, Harry ran to us and sprang to her side. "Desiree!" he cried, lifting her in his arms. She opened her eyes and smiled at him, and he kissed her many times, her hair, her lips, her eyes. Then he placed her gently on her feet, and, supporting her with his arm, moved forward slowly. I led the way. The lane ahead of us was scarcely more than a crevice between the rocks. I squeezed my way through with difficulty. Then the walls ended abruptly, just when I had begun to think we could go no farther, and we found ourselves at the entrance to a cavern so large that no wall was to be seen on any side save the one behind us. On the instant I guessed at the reason why the Incas had ceased their pursuit so abruptly, and I turned to Harry. "I'm afraid we've jumped from the frying pan into the fire. If this cavern holds anything like that other you remember." "If it does, we shall see," he replied. Supporting Desiree on either side, we struck out directly across the cavern, halting every few steps to listen for a sound, either of the Incas, which we feared, or of running water, which we desired. We heard neither. All was blackness and the most complete silence. Then I became aware, for the first time, of intolerable pain shooting up through my legs into my body. The danger past, reason returned, and feeling. I could not suppress a low cry, wrung inexorably from my chest, and I halted, leaning my whole weight on Desiree's shoulder. "What is it?" she cried, and for answer, though I strained every atom of my will and strength to prevent it, I toppled to the ground, dragging her with me. What followed came to me as in a dream, though I was not wholly unconscious. I was aware that Harry and Desiree were bending over me. Then I felt my head and shoulders being lifted from the ground, and a soft, warm arm supporting me. A minute passed, or an hour, I did not know, and I felt hot drops of moisture fall on my cheek. I struggled to open my eyes, and saw Desiree's face quite near my own. My head was resting on her shoulder. She was weeping silently, and great tears rolled down her cheeks unrestrained. To have seen the sun or stars shining down upon me would not have astonished me more. I gazed at her a long moment in silence. She saw that I did so, but made no effort to turn her head or avoid my gaze. Finally I found my tongue. "Where is Harry?" I asked. "He has gone to look for water," she replied, and, curiously enough, her voice was quite steady. I smiled. "It is useless. I am done for." "That isn't true," she denied, in a voice almost of anger. "You will get well. You are injured badly." After a short pause she added, "For me." There was a long silence. I thought it hardly worth while to contradict her, and then I said simply, "Why are you crying, Desiree?" She looked at me as though she had not heard. Then, after another silence, her voice came, so low that it barely reached my ears. For this, and for what might have been, my friend." "But you have said—" "I know. Would you make me doubt again? Do not. Ah!" She passed her hand gently over my forehead and touched the tips of her fingers to my burning eyes. "You must have cared for me in that other world. I will not doubt it, unless you speak, and you must not. Nothing would have been too high for us. We could have opened any door, even the door to happiness." "But you said once— forgive me if I remind you of it now— you said that you called yourself La Marana." She shrank back, exclaiming, "Paul! Indeed, I need to forgive you." "Still, it is true," I persisted, turning to look at her. The movement caused me to halt, closing my eyes, while a great wave of pain swept over me from head to foot. Then I went on: "Could you expect to confine your heart? You say we could have opened any door. Well, tell me, what could we have done, you and I?" "But that is what I do not think of," cried Desiree impatiently. "I would perhaps have placed my hand on your heart, as I do now. You would perhaps have fought for me, as you have done. I might even—" She hesitated, while the ghost of a smile that had died before it reached the light appeared on her lips, as her head was lowered close, quite close, to mine. A long moment, and then— "Must I ask for it?" I breathed. She jerked her head up sharply. "You do not want it," she said dryly. I raised my hand, groping for her fingers, but could not find them. She saw, and slowly, very slowly, her hand crept to mine and was caught and held there. "Desiree, I want it," I said half fiercely, and I forgot my pain and our danger, forgot everything but her white face in dim outline above me, and her eyes, glowing and tender against her wish, and her hand that nestled in my hand. "Be merciful to me. I want it as I have never wanted anything in my life. Desiree, I love you." At that I felt her hand move quickly, as for freedom, but I held it fast. And then slowly her head was lowered. I waited breathlessly. I felt her quick breath on my face, and the next moment her lips had found my lips, hot and dry, and remained there. Then she raised her head, saying tremulously: "That was my soul, and it is the first time it has ever escaped me." At the same instant we were startled by the sound of Harry's voice in the darkness. "Desiree, where are you?" I waited for her to answer, but she was silent, and I called out to him our direction. A moment later his form appeared at a distance, and soon he had joined us. "How about it, old man?" he asked, bending over me. Then he told us that he had found no water. He had explored two sides of the cavern, one at a distance of half a mile or more, and was crossing to find the third when he had called to us. "But there is little use," he finished gloomily. "The place is silent as the grave. If there were water we would hear it. I can't even find an exit except the crevice that let us in." Desiree's hand was still in mine. "It may be perhaps I can go with you," I suggested. But he would not hear of it, and set out again alone in the opposite direction to that which he had taken previously. In a few minutes he returned, reporting no better success than before. On that side, he said, the wall of the cavern was quite close. There was no sign anywhere of water, but to the left there were several narrow lanes leading at angles whose sides were nearly parallel to each other, and some distance to the right there was a broad and clear passage sloping downward directly away from the cavern. "Is the passage straight?" I asked, struck with a sudden idea. "Could you see far within?" 100 feet or so," was the answer. "Why? Shall we follow it? Can you walk?" "I think so," I answered. "At any rate, I must find some water soon or quit the game. But that isn't why I asked. Perhaps it explains the sudden disappearance of the Incas. They knew they couldn't follow us through that narrow crevice. What if they had made for the passage?" Harry grumbled that we had enough trouble without trying to borrow more. We decided to wait a little longer before starting out from the cavern. Harry helped me to my feet to give them a trial, and though I was able to stand, it was only by a tremendous effort and exertion of the will. "Not yet," I murmured between clenched teeth, and again Desiree sat on the hard rock and supported my head and shoulders in her arms, despite my earnest remonstrances. Harry stood before us, leaning on his spear. Soon he left us again, departing in the direction of the crevice by which we had entered. I detected his uneasiness in the tone with which he directed us to keep a lookout around in every direction. "We could move to the wall," I had suggested, but he shook his head, saying that where we were we at least had room to turn. When he had gone, Desiree and I sat silent for many minutes. Then I tried to rise, insisting that she must be exhausted with the long strain she had undergone, but she denied it vehemently and refused to allow me to move. "It is little enough," she said, and though I but half understood her, I made no answer. I myself was convinced that we were at least near the end. It was certain that the Incas had merely delayed, not abandoned, the pursuit, and our powers and means of resistance had been worn to nothing. Our curious apathy and half indifference spoke for itself. It was as though we had at length recognized the hand of fate and seen the futility of further struggle. For, weak and injured as I was, I still had strength in me. It was a listlessness of the brain and hopelessness of the heart that made me content to lie and wait for whatever might come. The state of my feelings toward Desiree were even then elusive. They are more so now. I had told her I loved her. Well, I had told many women that. But Desiree had moved me. With her it was not the same that I felt. I had never so admired a woman, and the thrill of that kiss is in me yet. I can recall it and tremble under its power by merely closing my eyes. Her warm hand, pressed tightly in my own, seemed to send an electric communication to every nerve in my body, and eased my suffering and stilled my pain. That, I know, is not love. And perhaps I was mistaken when I imagined that it was there. "Are you asleep?" she asked presently, after I had lain perfectly quiet for many minutes. Her voice was so low that it entered my ear as the faintest breath. "Hardly," I answered. "To tell the truth, I expect never to sleep again. I suppose you understand me. I can't say why. I feel it." Desiree nodded. "Do you remember, Paul, what I said that evening on the mountain?" Then, I suppose my face must have betrayed my thought, she added quickly, "Oh, I didn't mean that other thing. I said this mountain would be my grave. Do you remember? You see, I knew." I started to reply, but was interrupted by Harry, calling to ask where we were. I answered, and soon he had joined us and seated himself beside Desiree on the ground. "I found nothing," was all he said, wearily, as he lay back and closed his eyes, resting his head on his hands. The minutes passed slowly. Desiree and I talked in low tones. Harry moved about uneasily in his hard bed, saying nothing. Finally, despite Desiree's energetic protests, I rose to my knees and insisted that she rest herself. We seemed none of us to be scarcely aware of what we were doing. Our movements had a curious purposelessness about them that gave the thing an appearance of unreality. I know not what. It comes to my memory as some indistinct and haunting nightmare. Suddenly, as I sat gazing dully into the semi-darkness of the cavern, I saw that which drove the apathy from my brain with a sudden shock, at the same time paralyzing my senses. I strained my eyes ahead. There could be no doubt of it. That black, slowly moving line was a band of Incas creeping toward us silently, on their knees, through the darkness. Glancing to either side, I saw that the line extended completely around us, to the right and left. The sight seemed to paralyze me. I tried to call to Harry. No sound came from my eager lips. I tried to put out my hand to rouse him and to pick up my spear. My arms remained motionless at my side. Desiree lay close beside me. I could not even turn my head to see if she, too, saw, but kept my eyes, as though fascinated, on that silent, black line approaching through the darkness. Will they leap now? 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 I asked myself with every beat of my pulse. It could not be much longer. They were now so close that each black, tense form was in clear outline not 50 feet away. End of chapter 22. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 23 of Under the Andes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Under the Andes by Rex Stout. Chapter 23. We Are Two. Whether I would have been able to rouse myself to action before the shock of the assault was actually upon us, I shall never know. It was not fear that held me, for I felt none. I think that dimly and half unconsciously I saw in that black line, silently creeping upon us, the final and inexorable approach of the remorseless fate that had pursued us ever since we had dashed after Desiree into the cave of the devil, rendering our every effort futile, our most desperate struggles the laughing-stock of the gods. I was not even conscious of danger. I sat as in a stupor. But action came, though not from me, so suddenly that I scarcely knew what had happened. There was a cry from Desiree. Harry sprang to his feet. The Incas leaped forward. I felt myself jerked violently from the ground, and a spear was thrust into my hand. Harry's form flashed past me, shouting to me to follow. Desiree was at his heels, but I saw her halt and turn to me, and I, too, sprang forward. Harry's spear whirled about his head, leaving a gap in the black line that was now upon us. Through it we plunged. The Incas turned and came at us from behind. One whose hands were upon Desiree got my spear in his throat and sank to the ground. "Cross to the left!" Harry yelled. He was fighting them off from every direction at once. I turned, calling to Desiree to follow, and dashed across the cavern. We saw the wall just ahead, broken and rugged. Again turning, I called to Harry, but could not see him for the black forms on every side, and I was starting to his rescue when I saw him plunge toward us, cutting his way through the solid mass of Incas as though they had been stalks of corn. He was not a man, but a demon possessed. "Go on!" he shouted. "I'll make it!" Then I turned and ran with Desiree to the wall. We followed it a short distance before we reached one of the lanes of which Harry had spoken. At its entrance he joined us, still bidding us to leave him to cover our retreat. Once within the narrow lane, his task was easier. Boulders and projecting rocks obstructed our progress, but they were even greater obstacles to those who pursued us. Still they rushed forward, only to be hurled back by the point of Harry's spear. Once, turning, I saw him pick one of them up bodily and toss him whirling through the air into the very faces of his comrades. I had all I could do with Desiree and myself. Many times I scrambled up the steep face of some boulder and, after pulling her up safely after me, let her down again on the other side. Then I returned to see that Harry got over safely, and often he made it barely by inches, while flying spears struck the rock on every side. It is a wonder to me now that I was able even to stand, after my experience on the spiral stairway in the column. The soles of my feet and the palms of my hands were baked black as the Incas themselves. Blisters covered my body from head to foot, swelling, indescribably painful. Every step I took made me clench my teeth to keep from sinking in a faint to the ground. I expected always that the next would be my last. But somehow I struggled onward. It was the thought of Desiree, I think, that held me up, and Harry. Suddenly a shout came from Harry that the Incas had abandoned the pursuit. It struck me almost as a matter of indifference, nor was I affected when almost immediately afterward he called that he had been mistaken, and that they had rushed forward with renewed fury, and in greater numbers. "It is only a matter of time now," I said to Desiree, and she nodded. Still we went forward. The land had carried us straight away from the cavern, without a turn. Its walls were the roughest I had seen, and often a boulder which lay across our path presented a serrated face that looked as though it had just been broken from the wall above. Still the stone was comparatively soft. Time had not yet worked its leveling finger on the surfaces that surrounded us. We were standing on one of these boulders when Harry came running toward us. "They're stopped," he cried gleefully, "at least for a little. A piece of rock as big as a house gently slid from above onto their precious heads. It may have blocked them off completely." We hurried forward then. Harry helped Desiree, while I painfully brought up the rear. At every few steps they were forced to halt and wait for me, though I did my utmost to keep up with them. Harry had taken my spear that I might have both hands, to help me over the rocks. Climbing, sliding, jumping, we left the Incas behind. No sound came from the rear. I began to think that they had really been completely shut off, and several times opened my mouth to call to Harry to ask him if it would not be safe to halt, for every movement I made was torture. But each time I choked back the cry. He thought it was necessary to go on, and I followed. This lasted I know not how long. I was staggering and reeling forward like a drunken man, so little aware of what I was doing that when Harry and Desiree finally stopped at the beginning of a level, unbroken stretch in the lane, I stumbled directly against them before I knew they had halted. "Go on!" I gasped, struggling to my feet in a mania. Harry stooped over to assist me and set me with my back resting against the wall. Desiree supported herself near by, scarcely able to stand. "We can go no farther," said Harry. "If they come—" As he spoke I became aware of a curious movement in the wall opposite, a movement as of the wall itself. At first I thought it a delusion produced by my disordered brain, but when I saw Desiree's astonished gaze following mine, and heard Harry's cry of wonder as he turned and saw it also, I knew the thing was real. A great portion of the wall, the entire side of the passage for a length of 100 feet or more, was sliding slowly downward. Glancing above, I saw a space of several feet where the rock had departed from its bed. The only noise audible was a low, grating sound, like the slow grinding of a gigantic millstone. None of us moved. If there were danger, we would seem to have welcomed it. Suddenly the great mass of rock appeared to halt in its downward movement, and hang as though suspended. Then with a sudden jerk it seemed to free itself, swaying ponderously toward us, and the next movement it had fallen straight down into some abyss below, thundering, tumbling, sliding with terrific velocity. There was a deafening roar under our feet, the ground rocked as from an earthquake, and it seemed as though the wall against which we stood was about to fall in upon us. Dust and fragments of rock filled the air on every side, and one huge boulder, detached from the roof above, came tumbling at our feet, missing us by inches. We were completely stunned by the cataclysm, but in a moment Harry had recovered and run to the edge of the chasm opposite thus suddenly formed. Desiree and I followed. There was nothing to be seen save the blackness of space. Immediately before us was an apparently bottomless abyss, black and terrifying. The side descended straight down from our feet. Looking across, we could see dimly a wall some distance away, smooth and with a faint whiteness. On either side of us other walls extended to meet the farther wall, smooth and polished as glass. "The Incas didn't do that, I hope," said Harry, turning to me. "Hardly," I answered, and in the absorbing interest in the phenomenon before me I half forgot my pain. I moved to the edge of one of the walls extending at right angles to the passage, but there was little to be made of it. It was of soft limestone, and most probably the portion that had disappeared was granite, carried away by the force of its own weight. "We are like to be buried," I observed, returning to Harry and Desiree. "Though for that matter, even that can hardly frighten us now." "For my part," said Harry, with a curious gravity beneath the apparent lightness of his words, "I have always admired the death of Porthos. Let it come, and welcome." "Are we to go further?" put in Desiree. Just as Harry opened his mouth to reply, a more decisive answer came from another source. The rock that had fallen, obstructing the path of the Incas, must have left an opening that Harry had missed. Or they had removed it, what matter? In some way they had forced a passage, for as Desiree spoke, a dozen spears whistled through the air past our heads, and we looked up to see a swarm of Incas climbing and tumbling down the face of a boulder over which we had passed to reach our resting place. I have said that we had halted in a level, unbroken stretch that still led some distance ahead of us. At its farther end could be seen a group of rocks and boulders completely choking the lane. Beyond, other rocks arose to a still greater height. The way appeared to be impassable. But there was no time for deliberation or the weighing of chances, and we turned and made for the pile of rocks, with the Incas rushing after us. There Desiree and I halted in despair, but with a great oath Harry brushed us aside and leaped upon a rock higher than his head with incredible agility. Then, lying flat on his face and extending his arms downward over the edge, he pulled first Desiree, then myself, up after him. The whole performance had occupied a scant 2 seconds, and waiting only to pick up the 3 spears he had thrown up the sloping surface of the rock to another yet higher and steeper. "Why don't we hold them here?" I demanded. "They could never come up that rock with us on top." Harry looked at me. "Spears," he said briefly, and of course he was right. They would have picked us off like birds on a limb. We scaled the second rock with extreme difficulty, Harry assisting both Desiree and me. And as we stood upright on its top, I saw the Incas scrambling over the edge of the one below. 2 or 3 of them had already started to cross. Many more were coming up from behind, and one, as he made the top and arose to his feet, braced himself on the sloping rock and raised a spear high above his head. At sight of him I started, crying to Harry and Desiree. They turned. "The king!" I shouted, and I saw a shudder of terror run over Desiree's face, as she too recognized the black form below. At the same instant the spear darted forward from the hand of the Child of the Sun, but it landed harmlessly against the rock several feet away. The next moment the Inca king had bounded across the rock toward us, followed by a score of others. I was minded to try my luck with his own weapon, but we had no spears to waste, and Harry was dragging Desiree forward and shouting to me to follow. I turned and ran after them. And just as we let ourselves down into a narrow crevice below, the Incas appeared over the edge of the rock behind. Somehow we scrambled forward, with the Incas at our heels. Sharp corners of projecting rocks bruised our faces and bodies. Once my leg bent double under me as I fell from a ledge onto a boulder below, and I thought it was broken. But Harry jerked me to my feet, and I struggled on. Harry seemed possessed of the strength of 10 men and the heart of 1,000. He pulled Desiree and me up and over boulders and rocks as though we had been feathers. The Lord knows how he got there himself. Half of the time he carried Desiree, the other half he supported me. His energy and exertions were titanic. Even in the desperate excitement of our retreat I found time to marvel at it. We did not gain an inch. Our pursuers kept close behind us, but we held our own. Now and then a stray spear came hurtling through the air or struck the rock near us, but they were infrequent and we were not hit. One, flying past my head, stuck in a crevice of the rock and I grasped the shaft to pull it out, but abandoned my effort when I heard Harry shouting to me from the front to come to his aid. He and Desiree were standing on the rim of a ledge that stood high above the ground of the passage. At its foot began a level stretch leading straight ahead as far as we could see. "We must lift her down," Harry was saying. He let himself over the edge, hung by his hands, and dropped. "All right," he called from below, and I lay flat on the rock while Desiree scrambled over the edge, holding to my hands. For a moment I held her suspended in my outstretched arms, then, at a word from Harry, I let her drop. Another moment and I was over myself, knocking Harry to the ground and tumbling on top of him as he stood beneath to break my fall. By then the Incas had reached the top of the ledge above us, and we turned and raced down the long stretch ahead. I was in front. Harry came behind with Desiree. Suddenly, as I ran, I felt a curious trembling of the ground beneath my feet, similar to the vibrations of a bridge at the passing of a heavy load. Then the ground actually swayed beneath me, and, realizing the danger, I sent a desperate shout to Harry over my shoulder and bounded forward. He was at my side on the instant, with Desiree in his arms. The ground rocked beneath our feet like a ship in a storm, and just as I thought we were gone, my foot touched firm rock as I passed a yawning crevice a foot wide under me. One more leap to safety, and we turned just in time to see the floor of the passage which we had just traversed disappear into some abyss beneath with a shattering roar. We stood at the very edge of the chasm thus suddenly formed, gazing at each other in silent wonder and awe. "The beggars are stopped now," said Harry finally. "That break in the game is ours." Looking back across the chasm, we saw the Incas tumbling by 2s and 3s over the boulder on the other side. As they saw the yawning abyss that separated them from their prey, they stopped short and gazed across in profound astonishment. Others came to join them, until there were several hundred of the black, ugly forms huddled together on the opposite rim of the chasm 100 feet away. I ran over the group with a keen eye, seeking the figure of the Inca king, and soon my search was successful. He stood a step in front of the others, a little to the right. I pointed him out to Harry and Desiree. "It's up to him to walk right out again," said Harry. Desiree shivered and proceeded to send her last invitation to the devil. Turning suddenly, she grasped Harry's spear and tore it from his hand. Before we realized her purpose, she stepped forward until her foot rested on the very edge of the chasm, and had hurled the spear across, straight at the Inca king. It missed him, but struck another Inca standing near full in the breast. Quick as lightning the king turned, grasped the shaft of the spear and pulled it forth, and with his white teeth gleaming in a snarl of furious hate, sent it whistling through the air straight at Desiree. Harry and I sprang forward with a shout of warning. Desiree stood motionless as a statue. We grasped her frantically and pulled her back, but too late. She came, but only to fall lifeless into our arms with the spear buried deep in her white throat. We laid her on the ground and knelt beside her for a moment, then Harry arose to his feet with a face white as death, and I uttered a silent and vengeful prayer as I saw him level a spear at the Inca king across the chasm, but it went wide of its mark, striking the ground at his feet. "There was another," cried Harry, and soon he had found it where it lay on the ground and sent it too hurtling across. This time he missed by inches. The spear flew just past the shoulder of the king and caught one who stood behind him full in the face. The stricken savage threw his arms spasmodically above his head, reeling forward against the king. There was a startled movement along the black line. Hands were outstretched in a vain effort at rescue. A savage cry burst from Harry's lips, and the next instant the king had toppled over the edge of the chasm and fallen into the bottomless pit below. Harry turned, quivering from head to foot. "Little enough," he said between his teeth, and again he knelt beside the body of Desiree and took her in his arms. But her fate spoke eloquently of our own danger, and I roused him to action. Together we picked up the form of our dead comrade and carried it to the rear. I hesitated to pull forth the barbed head of the spear, and instead broke off the shaft, leaving the point buried in the soft throat, from which a crimson line extended over the white shoulder. A short distance ahead we came to a projecting boulder, and behind that we gently laid her on the hard rock. Neither of us had spoken a word. Harry's lips were locked tightly together. A lump rose in my throat, choking all utterance and filling my eyes with tears. Harry knelt beside the white form, and, gathering it gently in his arms, held it against his breast. I stood at his side, gazing down at him in mute sympathy and sorrow. For a long minute there was silence, a most intense silence throughout the cavern, during which the painful throbbing of my heart was plainly audible. Then Harry murmured, in a voice of the utmost tenderness, "Desiree," and again, "Desiree, Desiree," until I half expected the very strength and sweetness of his emotion to bring our comrade back to life. Suddenly, with a quick, impulsive movement, he raised his head to glance at me. "She loved you," he said. And though there was neither jealousy nor anger in his voice, somehow I could not meet his gaze. "She loved you," he repeated in a tone half of wonder. "And you—" I answered his eyes. "She was yours," I said, with a touch of bitterness that persuaded him of the truth. All her beauty, all her loveliness, all her charm, to be buried. Oh, God help us! My voice broke, and I knelt on the ground beside Harry and pressed my lips to the white forehead and golden hair of what had been Le Mire. Thus we remained for a long time. It was hard to believe that death had in reality taken possession of the still form stretched as in repose before us. Her body, still warm, seemed quivering with the instinct of life. But the eyes were not the eyes of Desiree. I closed them and arranged the tangled mass of hair as well as possible over her shoulders. As I did so, the air, set in motion by my hand, caused some of the golden strands to tremble gently across her lips, and Harry bent forward with a painful eagerness, thinking that she had breathed. "Dearest," he murmured, "dearest, speak to me." His hand sought her swelling bosom gropingly, and his eyes, as they looked pleadingly even into mine, shot into my heart and unnerved me. I rose to my feet, scarcely able to stand, and moved away. But the fate that had finally intervened for us, too late, alas, for one, did not leave us long with our dead. Even now I do not know what happened. At the time I knew even less. Harry told me afterward that the first shock came at the instant he had taken Desiree in his arms and pressed his lips to hers. I had crossed to the other side of the passage and was gazing back toward the chasm at the Incas on the other side, when again I felt the ground, absolutely without warning, tremble violently under my feet. At the same moment there was a low, curious rumble as of the thundering of distant cannon. I sprang toward Harry with a cry of alarm, and had crossed about to the middle of the passage when a deafening roar smote my ear, and the entire wall of the cavern appeared to be falling in upon us. At the same time the ground seemed to sink directly away beneath my feet, with an easy, rocking motion as of a wave of the ocean. Then I felt myself plunging downward with a velocity that stunned my senses and took away my breath. Then all was confusion and chaos, and oblivion. When I awoke I was lying flat on my back, and Harry was kneeling at my side. I opened my eyes and felt that it would be impossible to make a greater exertion. "Paul!" cried Harry. "Speak to me! Not you, too! I shall go mad!" He told me afterward that I had lain unconscious for many hours, but that appeared to be all that he knew. How far we had fallen, or how he had found me, or how he himself had escaped being crushed to pieces by the falling rock, he was unable to say, and I concluded that he too had been rendered unconscious by the fall, and for some time dazed and bewildered by the shock. Well, we were alive, that was all. For we were weak and faint from hunger and fatigue and one mass of bruises and blisters from head to foot. And we had had no water for something like 24 hours. Heaven only knows where we found the energy to rise and go in search of it. It is incredible that any creatures in such a pitiable and miserable condition as we were could have been propelled by hope, unless it is indeed immortal. Half walking, half crawling, we went forward. The place where we had found ourselves was a jumbled mass of boulders and broken rock, but we soon discovered a passage, level and straight as any tunnel built by man. Down this we made our way. Every few feet we stopped to rest. Neither of us spoke a word. I really had no sense of any purpose in our progress. I crept on exactly as some animals, wounded to death, move on and on until there is no longer strength for another step, when they lie down for the final breath. We saw no water nor promise of any. Nothing save the long stretch of dim vista ahead and the grim, black walls on either side. That, I think, for hours. It seemed to me then for years. I dragged one leg after the other with infinite effort and pain. Harry was ahead, and sometimes, glancing back over his shoulder to find me at some distance behind, he would turn over and lie on his back till I approached. Then again to his knees, and again forward. Neither of us spoke. Suddenly, at a great distance down the passage, much further than I had been able to see before, I saw what appeared to be a white wall extending directly across our path. I called to Harry and pointed it out to him. He nodded vaguely, as though in wonder that I should have troubled him about so slight an object of interest, and crawled on. But the white wall became whiter still, and soon I saw that it was not a wall. A wild hope surged through me. I felt the blood mount dizzily to my head, and I stilled the clamor that beat at my temples by an extreme effort of the will. "It can't be," I said to myself aloud, over and over. "It can't be. It can't be." Harry turned, and his face was as white as when he had knelt by the body of Desiree, and his eye was wild. "You fool!" he roared. "It is!" We went faster then. Another 100 yards, and the thing was certain. There it was, before us. We scrambled to our feet and tried to run. I reeled and fell, then picked myself up again and followed Harry, who had not even halted as I had fallen. The mouth of the passage was now but a few feet away. I reached Harry's side, blinking and stunned with amazement and the incredible wonder of it. I tried to shout, to cry aloud to the heavens, but a great lump in my throat choked me, and my head was singing dizzily. Harry, at my side, was crying like a child, with great tears streaming down his face, as together we staggered forth from the mouth of the passage into the bright and dazzling sunshine of the Andes. End of chapter 23. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 24 of Under the Andes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Under the Andes by Rex Stout. Chapter 24. Conclusion. Never, I believe, were misery and joy so curiously mingled in the human breast as when Harry and I stood, barely able to stand, gazing speechlessly at the world that had so long been hidden from us. We had found the light, but had lost Desiree. We were alive, but so near to death that our first breath of the mountain air was like to be our last. The details of our painful journey down the mountain, over the rocks and crags, and through rushing torrents that more than once swept us from our feet, cannot be written, for I do not know them. The memory of the thing is but an indistinct nightmare of suffering. But the blind luck that seemed to have fallen over our shoulders as a protecting mantle at the death of Desiree stayed with us. And after endless hours of incredible toil and labor, we came to a narrow pass leading at right angles to our course. Night was ready to fall over the bleak and barren mountain as we entered it. Darkness had long since overtaken us, when we saw at a distance a large clearing, in the middle of which lights shone from the windows of a large house, whose dim and shadowy outline appeared to us surrounded by a halo of peace. But we were nearly forced to fight for it. The proprietor of the hacienda himself answered our none too gentle knock at the door, and he had no sooner caught sight of us than he let out a yell as though he had seen the devil in person, and slammed the door violently in our faces. Indeed, we were hardly recognizable as men. Naked, black, bruised, and bleeding, covered with hair on our faces and parts of our bodies, mine of recent growth, stubby and stiff, Our appearance would have justified almost any suspicion. But we hammered again on the door, and I set forth our pedigree and plight in as few words as possible. Reassured perhaps by my excellent Spanish, which could not, of course, be the tongue of the devil, and convinced by our pitiable condition of our inability to do him any harm, he at length reopened the door and gave us admittance. When we had succeeded in allaying his suspicions concerning our identity, though I was careful not to alarm his superstitions by mentioning the cave of the devil, which I thought was probably well known to him, he lost no time in displaying his humanity. Calling in some hombres from the rear of the hacienda, he gave them ample instructions, with medicine and food, and an hour later Harry and I were lying side by side in his own bed, a rude affair, but infinitely better than granite, refreshed, bandaged, and as comfortable as their kindly ministrations could make us. The old Spaniard was a direct descendant of the Good Samaritan, despite the slight difference in nationality. For many weeks he nursed us and fed us and coaxed back the spark of life in our exhausted and wounded bodies. Our last ounce of strength seemed to have been used up in our desperate struggle down the side of the mountain. For many days we lay on our backs, absolutely unable to move a muscle and barely conscious of life. But the spark revived and fluttered. The day came when we could hobble, with his assistance, to the door of the hacienda and sit for hours in the invigorating sunshine, and thenceforward our convalescence proceeded rapidly. Color came to our cheeks and light to our eyes, and one sunny afternoon it was decided that we should set out for Cerro de Pasco on the following day. Harry proposed a postponement of our departure for 2 days, saying that he wished to make an excursion up the mountain. I understood him at once. "It would be useless," I declared. "You would find nothing." "But she was with us when we fell," he persisted, not bothering to pretend that he did not understand me. "She came. It must be near where we landed." "That isn't it," I explained. "Have you forgotten that we have been here for over a month? You would find nothing." As he grasped my thought, his face went white and he was silent. So on the following morning we departed. Our host furnished us with food, clothing, mules, and an arriero, not to mention a sorrowful farewell and a hearty blessing. From the door of the hacienda he waved his sombrero as we disappeared around a bend in the mountain pass. We had, perhaps, been a welcome interruption in the monotony of his lonely existence. We were led upward for many miles until we found ourselves again in the region of perpetual snow. There we set our faces to the south. From the arriero we tried to learn how far we then were from the cave of the devil, but to our surprise were informed that he had never heard of the thing. We could see that the question made him more than a little suspicious of us. Often, when he thought himself unobserved, I caught him eyeing us askance with something nearly approaching terror. We journeyed southward for 11 days. On the morning of the 12th we saw below us our goal. 6 hours later we had entered the same street of Cerro de Pasco through which we had passed formerly with light hearts, and the heart which had been gayest of all we had left behind us, stilled forever, somewhere beneath the mountain of stone which she herself had chosen for her tomb. Almost the first person we saw was none other than Felipe, the arriero. He sat on the steps of the hotel portico as we rode up on our mules. Dismounting, I caught sight of his white face and staring eyes as he rose slowly to his feet, gazing at us as though fascinated. I opened my mouth to call to him, but before the words left my lips he had let out an ear-splitting yell of terror and bounded down the steps and past us, with arms flying in every direction, running like one possessed. Nor did he return during the few hours that we remained at the hotel. 2 days later found us boarding the yacht at Callao. When I had discovered, to my profound astonishment, at the hacienda, that another year had taken us as far as the 10th day of March, I had greatly doubted if we should find Captain Harris still waiting for us. But there he was, and he had not even put himself to the trouble of becoming uneasy about us. As he himself put it that night in the cabin, over a bottle of wine, he didn't know but what the Senora had decided to take the Andes home for a mantel ornament, and was engaged in the little matter of transportation. But when I informed him that the Senora was no more, his face grew sober with genuine regret and sorrow. He had many good things to say of her then. It appeared that she had really touched his salty old heart. "She was a gentle lady," said the worthy captain, and I smiled to think how Desiree herself would have smiled at such a characterization of the great Lemire. We at once made for San Francisco. There, at a loss, I disposed of the remainder of the term of the lease on the yacht, and we took the first train for the East. 4 days later we were in New York, after a journey saddened by thoughts of the one who had left us to return alone. It was, in fact, many months before the shadow of Desiree ceased to hover about the dark old mansion on lower Fifth Avenue, incongruous enough among the ancient halls and portraits of Lamars, dead and gone, in a day when La Marana herself had darted like a meteor into the hearts of their contemporaries. That is, I suppose, properly the end of the story, but I cannot refrain from the opportunity to record a curious incident that has just befallen me. Some 20 minutes ago, as I was writing the last paragraph, I am seated in the library before a massive mahogany table, close to a window through which the September sun sends its golden rays. 20 minutes ago, as I say, Harry sauntered into the room and threw himself lazily into a large armchair on the other side of the table. I looked up with a nod of greeting, while he sat and eyed me impatiently for some seconds. "Aren't you coming with me down to Southampton?" he asked finally. "What time do you leave?" I inquired without looking up. 11:30. "What's on?" "Freddie Marston's Crocodiles and the Blues. It's going to be some polo." I considered a moment. "Why, I guess I'll run down with you. I'm about through here." "Good enough." Harry arose to his feet and began idly fingering some of the sheets on the table before me. "What is all this silly rot, anyway?" "My dear boy," I smiled, "you'll be sorry you called it silly rot when I tell you that it is a plain and honest tale of our own experiences." "Must be deuced interesting," he observed. "More silly rot than ever." "Others may not think so," I retorted, a little exasperated by his manner. "It surely will be sufficiently exciting to read of how we were buried with Desiree Lemire under the Andes, and our encounters with the Incas, and our final escape, and—" "Desiree what?" Harry interrupted. "Desiree Lemire," I replied very distinctly. "The great French dancer." "Never heard of her," said Harry, looking at me as if he doubted my sanity. "Never heard of Desiree, the woman you loved?" I almost shouted at him. "The woman Piffle! I say I never heard of her." I gazed at him, trembling with high indignation. "I suppose," I observed with infinite sarcasm, "that you will tell me next that you have never been in Peru?" "Guilty," said Harry. "I never have." "And that you never climbed Pike's Peak to see the sunrise?" "Rahway, New Jersey, is my farthest west." "And that you never dived with me from the top of a column 100 feet high?" "Not I. I retain a smattering of common sense." And that you did not avenge the death of Desiree by causing that of the Inca king?" "So far as that Desiree woman is concerned," said Harry, and his tone began to show impatience, "I can only repeat that I have never heard of the creature. And," he continued, "if you're trying to bamboozle a gullible world by concocting a tale as silly as your remarks to me would seem to indicate, I will say that as a cheap author you are taking undue liberties with your family, meaning myself. And what is more, if you dare to print the stuff, I'll let the world know it's a rank fake." This threat, delivered with the most awful resolution and sincerity, unnerved me completely, and I fell back in my chair in a swoon. When I recovered, Harry had gone to his polo game, leaving me behind, whereupon I seized my pen and hastened to set down in black and white that most remarkable conversation that the reader may judge for himself between us. For my part, I do swear that the story is true, on my word of honor as a cynic and a philosopher. End of chapter 24. Recording by Roger Melin. End of Under the Andes by Rex Stout.